Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable. Maybe a blanket, maybe a warm drink, maybe just the quiet corner of the room where the day has finally stopped asking things from you. Tonight, we are going somewhere most people think they already understand, but usually only from the outside. We are going to America in the Gilded Age, that strange, shining, crowded period after the Civil War, when the country seemed to wake up one morning and discover that everything was bigger than it had been before. The cities were bigger, the factories were bigger, the fortunes were bigger, the trains were longer, the banks were colder, the mansions had more rooms than any one family could reasonably need, and the men who owned them had names that sounded less like citizens and more like institutions. Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, Gould, Frick. Names that moved through newspapers, courtrooms, dinner tables and Senate chambers with the weight of weather. You may have heard those names before, maybe in school, maybe in a documentary, maybe attached to a library, a university, a museum, a foundation, or a building so dignified that it almost makes you forget how the money first arrived. And that is what we're going to sit with tonight. Not in a rushed way, not as a list of rich men and their scandals, not as a shouting argument about capitalism or corruption, but as a slow walk through a country that was being built, bought, welded, drilled, bribed, organised, and transformed all at the same time. Because the Gilded Age was not just an era when rich men had a great deal of money. Every age has rich men. That part is not new. What made this period so astonishing was that a handful of private fortunes became powerful enough to bend the daily life of an entire nation around them. A railroad owner could decide whether a farmer in Kansas could afford to send his wheat to market. An oil magnate could decide which refineries lived and which ones died. A steelman could shape the working hours of thousands of men who would never meet him, never speak to him, and yet would feel his decisions in their backs, their lungs, their pay envelopes, and the soot under their fingernails. A banker in New York could sit behind a desk, receive a telegram, speak quietly to 2 or 3 other men, and by evening, the fate of companies, towns, pensions, wages, and sometimes the federal government itself had shifted. That is the world we're entering. Not a palace exactly. Not a battlefield, though there were battles in it. Not a simple story of villains and victims either, because history rarely gives us anything that tidy. We are going into train stations, counting houses, factory yards, oil fields, coal towns, Senate corridors, hotel dining rooms, immigrant neighbourhoods, stock exchanges, locked offices, private rail cars and houses so large that a person could get lost inside them and still technically be at home. And somewhere behind all of it is the same question that kept returning to American life, again and again, in the late 1800s. Who actually controlled the country? Was it the voters who lined up at polling places? The presidents who stood on inaugural platforms? The workers who built the railroads and rolled the steel? Or the men whose names appeared at the bottom of contracts, whose money travelled faster than law, and whose influence often entered a room before they did? It is a question that sounds modern because, in a way, we have never stopped asking it. But tonight we are asking it where it first became impossible to ignore, in the years after the Civil War, when the United States was exhausted, ambitious, wounded, hungry, and ready to be remade by anyone bold enough, ruthless enough, or wealthy enough to seize the tools. Before we step fully into that world, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Maybe it is late where you are. Maybe the room is already dark. Maybe you are lying in bed with the volume low, half listening and half letting the story carry you along. Maybe you're on a couch, in a small apartment, in a quiet house, in a city full of lights, or in a place where the night outside the window feels still. Wherever you are, take a second and picture the nearest electric light around you. The lamp, the phone, the hallway bulb, the glow from another room. Now picture a man in the 1880s who owned the company that supplied that light, or the coal that fed the power station, or the copper wire that carried the current, or the railroad that moved the materials, or the bank that financed the whole thing. That is the Gilded Age in miniature. You touch one ordinary thing, and behind it, if you follow the line far enough, you find a fortune, and behind the fortune, a man who learned how to make himself necessary. That is the part that matters. These men did not simply become rich because they sold a product people wanted. They became rich because they placed themselves at the narrow points through which everyone else had to pass. The bridge, the track, the refinery, the mill, the bank, the shipping route, the telegraph line, the stock certificate, the political donation, the quiet agreement made over dinner where no minutes were taken and no ordinary person was invited to listen. There is almost a dark humour to the term Gilded Age, if you sit with it for a moment. Gilding is not solid gold. It is a thin, shining layer placed over something else. Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner helped popularise the term in 1873, and they chose it carefully. They were not describing an age of pure gold. They were describing an age that glittered on the surface while something rougher, cheaper, and more troubling sat underneath. And you can see why the phrase stuck. On the surface, America looked triumphant. Railroads stretched across the continent. Steel bridges crossed rivers that had once slowed entire regions. Cities climbed upward. Department stores glowed behind glass windows. Newspapers celebrated progress with the confidence of people who believed the future had already chosen their side. New inventions arrived so quickly that ordinary life began to feel unstable in ways both exciting and frightening. The telephone, the electric light, the elevator, the typewriter, the refrigerated rail car, the modern office, the mass-produced advertisement, all of it seemed to announce that the country was no longer a young republic trying to survive, but an industrial giant learning to flex its hands. But underneath that shine, there were children working in mills, men losing fingers in machines, families packed into tenements where the air itself seemed used up, miners going underground before sunrise and returning covered in coal dust, if they returned at all. There were farmers trapped by railroad rates and debt, small businessmen crushed by trusts, labour organisers beaten or blacklisted, senators who seemed less like representatives of states than representatives of industries, and presidents who sometimes looked small beside the private men who could summon them. This is the part history books often rush through because it is uncomfortable to explain that the same period which gave America libraries, universities, museums, concert halls, public parks, and charitable foundations also gave it some of the most brutal working conditions and most concentrated private power the nation had ever seen. Both things are true. That is what makes it worth our time. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like history told slowly, with the ordinary details left in and the uncomfortable parts not polished away, it would mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when you feel that little pull, when something in the story makes you pause and think, I did not know that, or I had never looked at it that way before. And if you want to tell me where you are listening from tonight, I genuinely love reading those comments. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that a story about a railroad office in 1877, or a steel mill outside Pittsburgh, or a mansion dinner in New York is being heard by someone in a bedroom in Ohio, a flat in London, a kitchen in Manila, a dorm room in Warsaw, or wherever the night has found you. Now let us ease into the story, because this is not a tale that begins with a single villain turning a key in a single locked door. It begins with a country that had just survived the Civil War and did not yet know what kind of peace it was entering. In 1865, the United States was not calm. The war had ended, slavery had been destroyed by blood and law, Abraham Lincoln was dead, the South was shattered, millions of formerly enslaved people were trying to claim lives that had been denied to them for generations, and the federal government had become larger and more powerful than it had ever been before. At the same time, the North had built factories, expanded railroads, sold bonds, organised banks, and discovered during wartime that industry could move at a speed earlier Americans would have found difficult to believe. War had created terrible destruction, but it had also created systems, contracts, supply chains, capital markets, railroad networks, government relationships with private companies, men who learned how to make money not by farming land or running a small shop, but by moving materials, controlling credit, managing transportation, and seeing the whole country as a machine that could be adjusted for profit. When peace came, those systems did not disappear. They turned outward. The energy that had helped produce rifles, uniforms, rails, locomotives, ships, and wartime finance began pouring into the making of a new industrial nation. For some people, this felt like opportunity on a scale almost too large to describe. For others, it felt like being dragged into a future they had not chosen by men they would never be allowed to confront. This is where the rich men of the Gilded Age become so important. They were not merely lucky. Many of them were intelligent, disciplined, tireless, and able to understand systems before other people understood what systems were becoming. Cornelius Vanderbilt saw that transportation was not just about boats or trains, but about routes, connections, and choke points. John D. Rockefeller understood that oil was not just something pulled from the ground, but something refined, shipped, priced, standardized, and controlled through agreements that could make competition almost impossible. Andrew Carnegie understood that steel was not merely metal, but the skeleton of the modern world, the thing needed for rails, bridges, buildings, machines, and war. JP. Morgan understood that money itself could be organized, that chaos in business could be turned into order by a banker powerful enough to decide which companies should live, merge, borrow, expand, or quietly disappear. Jay Gould understood markets and railroads with a coldness that made even other financiers wary. Henry Clay Frick understood coal, coke, discipline, and confrontation in ways that would help make fortunes and also help produce one of the most violent labor conflicts in American history. These men were not identical. They did not all come from the same background. Some began with advantages, some began with little. Some were pious in public and merciless in business. Some gave away money on a scale that still shapes American institutions. Some broke laws. Some shaped laws. Some operated in the grey spaces where law had not yet caught up with ambition. But together they helped to create something new in American life, something the country had no clear language for at first. A private ruling class whose power did not come from inherited titles, because America had no dukes, no earls, no official aristocracy, but from ownership, consolidation, debt, influence, and control over the arteries of daily life. They did not need crowns. A railroad schedule could do what a crown once did. A bank loan could command obedience. A trust agreement could accomplish what an army of tax collectors might have envied. The strange thing is that many Americans admired them for it. That's another part we need to understand honestly. The rich men of the Gilded Age were not universally hated by the public. Some were treated like proof that the American promise was real. Newspapers told stories of boys who began with nothing and rose through thrift, willpower, and long hours. Ministers preached about discipline and providence. Popular writers celebrated self-made men. Poor young clerks read success manuals and imagined that with enough effort they too might rise. There was a powerful emotional appeal in believing that the new fortunes were not a threat to democracy, but evidence of its possibilities. If one man could climb so high, perhaps the ladder was open to everyone. But ladders are complicated things. Someone owns the building they lean against. Someone decides where they are placed. Someone pulls them up when too many people begin to climb. By the 1880s and 1890s, it was becoming harder for ordinary Americans to believe that the game was fair. They could see the mansions rising on Fifth Avenue and Newport while wages stayed low. They could see railroad companies receiving land grants larger than some European countries. They could see courts treating corporations with a kind of respect that workers rarely received. They could see elected officials accepting favours, gifts, railroad passes, campaign money, and sometimes plain envelopes whose contents were not meant for public discussion. They could see that when workers organised, governors sent militia, judges issued injunctions, and newspapers called them dangerous. When corporations organised, they called it efficiency. Sit with that difference for a moment. A group of workers meeting in a hall to demand a shorter day might be described as a mob. A group of millionaires meeting in a private dining room to divide markets might be described as business leadership. The words mattered. They still do. Now, I do not want us to rush into judgment so quickly that we stop noticing the texture of the world these people inhabited. That is not how this kind of history works best. It is easy to say the rich controlled everything and leave it there. It is also too simple. What we need to do is walk through the rooms where control actually happened. Control did not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looked like a clerk copying figures into a ledger. Sometimes it looked like a telegraph operator tapping out prices. Sometimes it looked like a railroad rebate, an arrangement by which one large company secretly paid less to ship goods than its smaller competitors. Sometimes it looked like a dinner at Delmonico's, where a man with a soft voice and a hard face explained what would happen next. Sometimes it looked like a campaign contribution. Sometimes it looked like a judge signing a piece of paper. Sometimes it looked like silence from a newspaper, whose owner knew which advertisers paid the bills. Control rarely announces itself by walking into the street and shouting. More often, it sits behind a desk and makes itself ordinary. That is why the Gilded Age is so interesting. It shows us how power can wear a suit, speak politely, attend church, endow a university, shake a president's hand, and still reach into the kitchen of a worker's family by deciding whether wages will be cut next month. It shows us how wealth, once large enough, stops being only wealth and becomes environment. Something people live inside, something that determines what choices are available before anyone begins choosing. A farmer in Nebraska might never see New York, but if the railroad rate was too high, New York had reached him. A steelworker in Homestead might never meet Andrew Carnegie, especially when Carnegie was far away in Scotland during the crisis that would make his name bitter to many workers. But Carnegie's system reached him. A small refinery owner might never meet Rockefeller, but Rockefeller's agreements with railroads, suppliers and competitors could close around him until selling out looked less like a choice and more like the last available door. This is what we are going to follow. Not just the money, but the reach of the money. Not just the men, but the machinery of their influence. Not only the mansions, but the hands that built them, cleaned them, heated them, served in them, delivered coal to them, polished their banisters, and walked home afterward to rooms where 5 people might share air, thick with stove smoke and worry. We will move slowly through it because the pace matters. The Gilded Age was fast for the people living in it, sometimes frighteningly fast, but to understand it, we have to slow it down. We have to stand for a moment in a railroad depot and listen to the announcements. We have to watch a worker approach a factory gate before dawn. We have to sit in the back of a Senate chamber where a vote is being counted. We have to step into a Newport ballroom where the flowers cost more than a labourer might earn in months. We have to smell the oil, the coal smoke, the horse manure in the street, the sweat in the mill, the cigar smoke in the club, the ink in the newspaper office. History becomes clearer when it is allowed to have surfaces. The polished desk, the dirty cuff, the private rail car, the lunch pail, the marble staircase, the pay envelope, the telegram, the locked gate. The envelope passed from one hand to another in a room where everyone understands that no one will mention it later. Tonight, we begin at the edge of all that, with the country still pretending that it could grow rich without changing its soul. You can almost see the first lights coming on in the cities, the lamps in office windows, the furnaces burning through the dark outside Pittsburgh, the trains moving across black fields with sparks rising from their stacks. Somewhere, a young man is looking at those lights and thinking they mean possibility. Somewhere else, a woman is sewing by a weak lamp after a shift that has taken the strength from her hands. Somewhere in New York, a banker is reading a balance sheet. Somewhere in Cleveland, a refinery owner is realizing that the terms offered to him are not really an offer. Somewhere in Washington, a senator is preparing a speech about liberty while knowing very well which railroad helped pay for his campaign. The surface is bright. The machinery underneath is already moving. And the first thing we need to understand is how a nation that distrusted kings allowed a few men to build kingdoms without ever calling them that. The first kingdom did not announce itself with a flag or a throne. It appeared as a timetable. That may sound almost too ordinary, but in the decades after the Civil War, a railroad timetable could decide the shape of a town, the value of a farm, the price of food, the speed of migration, the movement of soldiers, the delivery of coal, and the future of whole regions that had previously been separated by distance. Before the railroad, distance had a kind of stubborn authority. A mountain range, a muddy road, a frozen river, a long wagon journey through bad weather. These things limited ambition. They slowed trade. They protected some local businesses simply because competitors were too far away to matter. The railroad changed that. It took the map and tightened it. Grain from the Midwest could reach eastern markets. Cattle from the plains could move towards slaughterhouses. Coal could feed factories. Immigrants arriving in New York could be carried inland. Finished goods could travel farther, faster, and with a regularity that earlier Americans would have found almost unnatural. The men who understood this first did not merely see tracks and engines. They saw control. Cornelius Vanderbilt was one of the earliest and clearest examples of that kind of mind. He had made his first great fortune in steamboats, not railroads, and by the time many men would have been content to sit in a warm room and enjoy being rich, Vanderbilt was already looking for the next artery of the nation. He was old, blunt, physically imposing, and famously uninterested in sounding refined. He did not need to sound refined. He had boats, then rail lines, then combinations of rail lines, and eventually a grip on transportation into and out of New York that made him nearly impossible to ignore. New York was not just a city. It was the financial heart, the immigrant gateway, the commercial mouth through which much of America breathed. To control the routes feeding that city was to hold something more valuable than a warehouse of goods. It was to hold access. Think about what that meant for the ordinary person. A farmer did not negotiate with Vanderbilt at a polished table. A shopkeeper did not sit across from him and discuss fairness. But if the railroad rate was too high, if the route was controlled, if a competing line had been absorbed or weakened, those decisions arrived quietly in the price of shipping, the cost of flour, the availability of goods, the chance of survival for a small business. Vanderbilt's power was not theatrical, it was structural. He placed himself in the path that commerce needed to travel, and once there, he could charge the country for passing through. That is one of the most important things to understand about the rich men of the Gilded Age. Their fortunes were not always built by inventing entirely new desires. People already needed to move, heat, eat, build, and trade. The genius, if we can use that word carefully, was in taking something necessary and positioning one's company between the need and its fulfillment. The railroad man did not need every American to love him. He only needed them to need the railroad, and they did. By the 1870s and 1880s, railroads were not simply one industry among many. They were the largest businesses in the country, the greatest consumers of steel, coal, land, labour and capital. They required enormous organisation. They required managers, engineers, telegraph operators, conductors, mechanics, accountants, lawyers, lobbyists, and armies of labourers. They also required money on a scale that drew Wall Street into the bloodstream of transportation. Tracks had to be financed before profits could be collected. Bonds had to be sold. Investors had to be reassured. Legislatures had to be persuaded to grant land, charters, subsidies, or favourable laws. A railroad was never just a railroad. It was a financial instrument, a political project, a machine of settlement, and a private empire laid across public land. This is why the men who controlled railroads often behaved less like businessmen and more like regional governors. They decided where stations would be built. A station could turn a settlement into a town. The absence of one could leave a community to shrink into obscurity. They decided which shipments moved quickly and which waited. They decided which companies received favourable treatment. They could offer secret rebates to large customers, allowing a giant corporation to ship at lower cost than a small competitor. On paper, two companies might be competing in the same market. In practice, one had a quiet agreement with the railroad, and the other was bleeding money every time it sent its product out the door. To the public, this could look like efficiency or luck. Behind the office door, it was often arrangement. Not all arrangements were illegal at the time. That is another detail that matters. The law was still trying to catch up with the scale of what these men were building. Older ideas about business had assumed smaller firms, local markets, and competition that could be understood by people watching from the street. The Gilded Age produced corporations so large, so spread out, so legally complicated, that even people inside them did not always see the whole machine. By the time reformers pointed to a practice and called it abusive, the fortune had often already been made. By the time a legislature debated regulation, the lobbyists had arrived. By the time the public understood the trick, a new one had been developed. Railroads taught America a lesson that oil and steel would learn very well. Size was not just an advantage. Size could become a weapon. John D. Rockefeller understood this with a calmness that made him one of the most formidable businessmen in American history. He did not look, in the popular imagination, like a conqueror. He was not a loud man in the Vanderbilt style. He was orderly, religious, careful with figures, patient, and in some ways, almost severe. He grew up with instability around him, including a father known for charm, absence, and dubious dealings, and Rockefeller seems to have built his life in reaction to uncertainty. He liked ledgers. He liked predictability. He liked the feeling that every barrel, every shipment, every contract, every cost could be known and managed. When oil was discovered in Pennsylvania in 1859, the early industry was chaotic, messy, and often wasteful. Wells boomed and failed. Prices swung wildly. Small refiners appeared quickly, chasing profit in a market that seemed to change by the week. It was noisy, dirty, speculative work. Men rushed into the oil regions, hoping for sudden wealth, and many lost everything just as quickly. Rockefeller did not want chaos. He wanted order, but his version of order meant that other people's independence had to disappear. Standard Oil, founded in 1870, became the instrument of that disappearance. Rockefeller's great insight was that the refining of oil could be controlled more reliably than the drilling of it. Wells were unpredictable. Refining, shipping, storage, barrels, pipelines, sales, and contracts could be organized. Standard Oil bought competitors, underpriced them, made secret shipping deals, secured rebates from railroads, pressured suppliers, acquired pipelines, and created a system in which resistance became more expensive than surrender. Imagine being a small refinery owner in Cleveland or Pittsburgh in the 1870s. You have your equipment, your workers, your customers, and perhaps a certain pride in having survived the volatility of the oil business. Then Standard Oil approaches. The offer may be polite, the numbers may be presented as reasonable, but behind the offer is a fact you cannot escape. Standard Oil ships more cheaply than you do. It buys more efficiently than you can. It can cut prices longer than you can survive. It has agreements you cannot see and influence you cannot match. If you refuse to sell, your business may be squeezed until the offer you receive later is worse. This is not the robber with a pistol on the road. It is something quieter and in some ways more difficult to resist. It is a man telling you that the future has already been organised and that your only remaining choice is whether to enter it willingly or be crushed outside it. By the early 1880s, Standard Oil controlled the overwhelming majority of American oil refining. That level of dominance is difficult to picture today unless we slow it down. It meant that kerosene, the fuel that lit lamps in millions of homes before electric light became common, passed through an empire built by one company's discipline and appetite. It meant that the light on a family table in Iowa, the lamp in a shop in Boston, the lantern carried by a worker before dawn, all of them were connected to decisions made by men who understood barrels, rail rates, and trust agreements better than almost anyone alive. Rockefeller would later give away immense sums of money. Universities, medical research, public health, education, all of these would be shaped by his philanthropy. That cannot be ignored. But philanthropy does not erase the method by which the fortune was assembled. It complicates it, which is exactly why it belongs in the story. The Gilded Age is full of men who gave libraries after they had helped create conditions that left workers too exhausted to read. It is full of public generosity built on private pressure. It asks us to hold two facts in the same hand without pretending that one cancels the other. Andrew Carnegie may be the clearest example of that tension, because his story has almost everything Americans like to believe about themselves, and almost everything they fear about power. Carnegie was born in Scotland and came to the United States as a poor immigrant child. His family settled in Allegheny, Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh, and Carnegie began working young. He was a bobbin boy in a textile mill, then a telegraph messenger, then a telegraph operator, then a railroad employee under Thomas Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He was bright, ambitious, eager to learn, and unusually gifted at attaching himself to the systems that mattered. The railroad taught him about scale, logistics, investment, and the importance of being near information before others had it. He learned that fortunes could be made not only from labour, but from timing, finance, connections, and control over materials. Steel became his great field. If railroads were the arteries of the new America, steel was its bone. Rails, bridges, beams, machinery, ships, and later skyscrapers depended on it. The Bessemer process and other improvements made steel production faster and cheaper than before, but technology alone did not make Carnegie rich. Many people knew steel mattered. Carnegie's strength was in building a system around it. He invested in mills, raw materials, transportation, and management methods that pushed costs downward. He wanted efficiency with almost moral intensity. He believed in competition, but he also believed that the producer with the lowest costs could dominate the market, and that domination was proof of fitness. His steelworks were not gentle places. They were hot, deafening, dangerous, and relentless. Men worked long shifts near furnaces that could kill in an instant. Molten metal did not forgive inattention. A mistake, a slipped foot, a burst of steam, a falling beam, a moment of exhaustion at the wrong time, and a man's life could change or end before anyone had time to speak. The fortune accumulated above this labour was discussed in drawing rooms and newspapers as evidence of progress. The labour itself often remained in the smoke. Carnegie liked to present himself as a friend of the working man, a man who had risen from poverty and understood the dignity of effort. He also argued that the wealthy had a duty to use their fortunes for the public good. His famous essay on wealth insisted that a rich man should live without vulgar extravagance and distribute his surplus in ways that helped society improve itself. Libraries became the symbol of that belief. They were real gifts. Thousands of people used them. Many lives were enlarged by them, and yet the steel empire that made those gifts possible depended on a labour system that did not feel benevolent to the men inside it. This contradiction becomes unavoidable when we approach Homestead, though we are not ready to stay there yet. For now, it is enough to understand that Carnegie's kingdom was built from iron ore, coal, coke, rail connections, disciplined management, technological change, and a belief that human work could be driven harder in the name of efficiency. If Vanderbilt controlled movement and Rockefeller controlled refinement, Carnegie controlled material transformation. He took the raw substances of the earth, and turn them into the framework of modern America. The bridge you crossed, the train rail beneath the wheels, the beam in the building, the machine in the factory, steel was everywhere, and Carnegie had made himself central to its supply. That is the pattern again. Become central. Become necessary. Let everyone else discover that they are living downstream from your decisions. J.P. Morgan's kingdom was different, quieter, and in some respects even more unsettling, because Morgan did not need to own every furnace or every mile of track directly. He worked through money, and money can move through walls. Morgan came from banking. He had the education, the family connections, the European relationships, and the temperament of a man who believed disorder was offensive. In the Gilded Age, American business was often chaotic. Railroads overbuilt, competed destructively, borrowed too much, collapsed, reorganized, and ruined investors. Industries expanded faster than markets could absorb. Speculation created bubbles. Panics shook the economy. Morgan looked at this disorder and saw opportunity, but also a kind of mission. He would rationalize. He would consolidate. He would bring competing firms together, reduce what he saw as wasteful rivalry, and place finance at the center of industrial order. To his admirers, he was a stabilizer, a man whose judgment could prevent collapse. To his critics, he was unelected power in its purest form, a banker whose private decisions could matter more than public policy. There were moments when the United States government itself seemed to rely on him. During the gold crisis of 1895, Morgan helped arrange a rescue of the Federal Gold Reserve. Later, in the panic of 1907, after the period we usually call the Gilded Age had begun shifting into the Progressive Era, Morgan famously gathered bankers in his library and pushed them toward agreements meant to stop financial panic from spreading. Picture that for a moment. Not a public chamber, not a national vote, a private library. Heavy furniture, locked doors, old paintings, men with fortunes and obligations sitting in a room while the financial stability of the country hangs over the table. This was not monarchy in the old sense. No crown, no hereditary title, no royal decree. But it was power so concentrated that democracy had to look through the window and wait. The people could vote for presidents, but presidents could find themselves negotiating with men whose control over credit gave them a different kind of sovereignty. That is why these figures fascinated and frightened their own time. Americans had overthrown kings in their founding story. They had rejected aristocracy as a principle. They liked to believe that no man was born to rule another. And yet, by the late 19th century, a country without titled nobles had produced private men whose houses looked like palaces, whose companies crossed state lines more easily than laws did, whose lawyers could delay regulation for years, and whose financial decisions reached into the ordinary home. It created a strange moral confusion. If a man built a fortune through intelligence and effort, was he a hero? If he used that fortune to destroy competitors and influence government, was he a danger? If he donated part of it to public causes, did that redeem him? If his workers lived under harsh conditions, did his library soften the fact? The Gilded Age did not answer these questions cleanly, because the people living in it could not answer them cleanly either. Some looked at Rockefeller and saw discipline rewarded. Others saw monopoly. Some looked at Carnegie and saw the immigrant dream. Others saw a steel empire that praised labour while grinding labourers down. Some looked at Morgan and saw order. Others saw private government. Some looked at Vanderbilt and saw boldness. Others saw the arrogance of a man who once seemed to tell the public that he owed them nothing. These arguments were not confined to editorials and speeches. They entered kitchens, union halls, farms, churches, and street corners. They entered the way people explained their own disappointments. A farmer facing high freight rates might not know the details of the railroad finance, but he knew the feeling of being trapped. A refinery owner forced to sell might not understand every clause in Standard Oil's agreements, but he knew when choice had become performance. A steelworker might hear speeches about progress and still come home too tired to lift his arms. A clerk in New York might dream of becoming rich and, at the same time, resent the men whose wealth made the city feel owned. This is the human weight of those industrial kingdoms. They were not only numbers in ledgers. They rearranged expectation. They taught Americans to think in new scales. $1 million became a figure that newspapers could print beside a man's name as if it were a title. Then 10 million. Then 100 million. The numbers grew so large that they became almost unreal to ordinary readers, but their effects remained practical. Rent, wages, food prices, rail rates, hours, safety, debt, the price of kerosene, the chance of a town getting a station, the existence of a job, the disappearance of a small competitor, the cost of a politician's loyalty. It would be comforting to imagine that these kingdoms were built far away from ordinary life, on a separate plane where rich men competed only with other rich men. But they were built directly through ordinary life. Every barrel loaded, every rail laid, every furnace fed, every invoice written, every vote influenced, every hand injured, every immigrant hired, every farmer charged, every lamp lit. The kingdoms were not beside America, they were inside it. And as they grew, their owners began to create a visible world around themselves that made the inequality impossible to miss. The money moved from ledgers into stone, marble, velvet, silver, stained glass, private clubs, opera boxes, and summer houses facing the sea. At the same time, the workers whose labour made the money possible crowded into boarding houses, company towns, and tenements where privacy was rare and fresh air could feel like a luxury. To understand the rich men fully, we cannot remain in their offices. We have to follow the money out into the streets, into the rooms it built for itself, and the rooms it left for everyone else, because the Gilded Age was not only measured in profits, it was measured in ceilings, staircases, windows, dinner tables, bedrooms, and the distance between a mansion entrance and a tenement stairwell. The distance could be only a few miles, sometimes only a few streets, but it might as well have been a border between two countries. In the same city, under the same smoke, using the same water system, lit by the same expanding networks of gas and electricity, one family could live behind carved doors, marble fireplaces, imported rugs, painted ceilings, and dining rooms large enough to make a meal feel like a public ceremony, while another family slept in a room where the bed was shared in shifts and the window opened onto a brick wall close enough to touch. This was one of the defining facts of the Gilded Age. Wealth was not hidden. It did not sit quietly in bank accounts or move only as numbers between ledgers. It became architecture. It turned into staircases, iron gates, carriage houses, conservatories, chandeliers, panelled libraries, private art collections, ball gowns, calling cards, silver services, and houses so large that the word house begins to feel almost inaccurate. At the same time, poverty also became architecture. It turned into narrow air shafts, dark stairwells, shared privies, damp basements, crowded sleeping rooms, broken plaster, indoor heat that failed in winter and trapped sickness in summer, and long rows of buildings where the purpose was not comfort but the extraction of rent from as many bodies as the walls could hold. To understand the Gilded Age, you have to look at both structures at once, because they were not separate stories. The mansion and the tenement belonged to the same city, the same economy, the same moral weather. One made the other more visible. In New York, the richest families moved uptown as the city grew, building along Fifth Avenue and around the spaces where wealth could display itself without apology. The old merchant fortunes, the Astors and their circle, guarded social prestige with a seriousness that now seems almost funny until you remember how much power was attached to acceptance. Mrs. Caroline Astor, with the help of Ward McAllister, became associated with the famous idea of the 400, the number of people supposedly able to fit inside her ballroom, and, more importantly, the number considered suitable for the highest level of New York society. 400 people in a city of more than 1 million. Think about that for a moment, not as gossip, but as a system. A society without noble titles built its own version of aristocracy out of invitation lists. To be admitted meant your money, manners, ancestry, marriage connections, and reputation had been weighed and found acceptable. To be excluded meant that no matter how much money you had, you were still not quite inside. This mattered deeply to the new rich, especially those whose fortunes had come from railroads, mines, meatpacking, oil, steel, or speculation. They had the money, sometimes more money than the old families could imagine, but social power had its own locked doors, so they built. They built bigger, grander, more conspicuously, as if limestone and marble could argue on their behalf. The Vanderbilt family became the perfect example. Cornelius Vanderbilt himself had been too rough-edged for the old society to embrace easily, but his descendants understood that money could be translated into display. Alva Vanderbilt, determined, intelligent, and not inclined to accept social humiliation quietly, helped stage one of the most famous social assaults of the age with her 1883 costume ball at the Vanderbilt Mansion on Fifth Avenue. The event was enormous, extravagant, and impossible for New York society to ignore. Guests arrived in elaborate costumes. Newspapers covered it with fascination. The old guard could sniff, but it could not pretend the Vanderbilts did not exist. A ballroom had become a weapon. A party had become a campaign. That is the sort of thing the Gilded Age made possible, and also the sort of thing that reveals how strange the era could be. While men in mills worked 12-hour days and families in tenements counted pennies for coal, New York's elite fought battles over who had the right to stand under chandeliers wearing imported silk. This is not to say the wealthy were unaware of the poor. Many of them were aware in the way a person is aware of weather beyond a window. They supported charities, founded institutions, sat on boards, gave money to hospitals, churches, museums, and schools. Some did so sincerely. Some did so for reputation. Many did so for both reasons, because human motives rarely arrive cleanly sorted. But the physical separation between their lives and the lives of working people grew wider, even when the geographic distance remained small. A mansion was not only a place to sleep, it was a performance of order. The entrance hall told visitors that the family had arrived. The drawing room showed taste. The dining room displayed command over food, service, and ritual. The library suggested education and seriousness, even when the books were as much decoration as reading. The servants' areas, usually tucked behind or below, kept the labour of the house out of sight so that comfort could appear natural. That is one of the quiet tricks of wealth. It hides the work required to sustain it. A guest entering a Gilded Age mansion might see flowers, polished floors, clean linens, a table laid with precision, fires properly tended, lamps trimmed or electric lights glowing, coats taken, food arriving in courses, and rooms kept at the right temperature. What the guest did not see, or was not meant to notice too closely, was the staff moving through back stairs, pantries, kitchens, laundries, storage rooms, and servant corridors. A large house needed cooks, maids, laundresses, footmen, coachmen, gardeners, butlers, housekeepers, seamstresses, and sometimes entire networks of specialists brought in for grand events. The mistress of the house might appear to live a life of leisure, but she too was managing a social machine, one with strict rules and high stakes, especially if her family was trying to climb or hold its place. Still, the machine depended on people whose own rooms were small, whose uniforms were not their own, whose hours were long, and whose work had to be done well enough to disappear. That disappearance is important. A polished mansion made labour invisible in the same way an elegant fortune could make its origins blurry. When you walk through photographs or descriptions of these houses today, it is easy to be seduced by the surfaces. The Breakers in Newport, built for Cornelius Vanderbilt II in the 1890s, rises like an Italian palace facing the Atlantic. Marble House, built for Alva Vanderbilt, cost a fortune and used marble on a scale meant to stun. The word cottage was sometimes used for these Newport homes, which is one of those details that tells you more than a long lecture could. A cottage with 70 rooms, a cottage with ballrooms and service wings, a cottage where the wealthy went to escape the pressures of the city by bringing almost every comfort of the city with them, along with the staff necessary to make escape feel effortless. The summer season in Newport was not simple rest. It was competition under the cover of leisure. Who entertained whom? Who sat at which table? Who arrived in what carriage? Who wore what? Who had imported which architect, which tapestries, which chef, which horses, which European ideas of aristocratic taste? America had rejected hereditary nobility in principle, but in Newport you can see the hunger for its atmosphere. Many rich Americans collected European art, copied European houses, married into European titles, and sent their daughters into alliances that exchanged American money for old world prestige. There is something almost tenderly insecure in that, if we look at it without laughing too quickly. These were people with more money than most aristocrats in Europe, and yet they often wanted the approval of the very social worlds the American Republic had supposedly left behind. The surface glittered, but the anxiety underneath was real. Money could buy marble. It could not always buy belonging fast enough. Now, leave that room slowly. Leave the ballroom before the candles burn low or the electric lights are switched off. Step out past the carriage entrance, past the men waiting in livery, past the horses stamping in the night air, past the streets where the wealthy move with the confidence of people who expect the city to arrange itself around them. Go downtown. Keep going until the streets narrow and the air changes. In the immigrant neighbourhoods of New York, especially on the Lower East Side, the city pressed people together with a force that is hard to imagine if you have always had a room to yourself. By the late 19th century, New York had become one of the great immigrant cities of the world. Germans, Irish, Italians, Jews from Eastern Europe, Chinese immigrants in smaller but significant communities, and many others arrived with different languages, religions, skills, fears, and hopes. They didn't enter a neutral city. They entered a market, and the market had already learned how to profit from their need for shelter. Tenements were built quickly and cheaply, often on lots 25 feet wide and 100 feet deep. Landlords wanted rent from every possible foot. Early tenements could be dark, airless, and dangerously overcrowded. Reform laws tried to improve conditions, but builders adapted. The so-called dumbbell tenement, encouraged by the 1879 law requiring air shafts, created narrow shafts between buildings that were supposed to bring light and ventilation. In practice, many of those shafts became traps for foul air, garbage, noise, and fire. Windows opened, technically, but not always onto anything that could fairly be called fresh air. A family might occupy 2 or 3 small rooms, with boarders taken in to help pay rent. Boarders were not an occasional inconvenience. They were often the difference between survival and eviction. A stranger might sleep on a chair, a mattress, a floor space, or a bed used by someone else during another shift. Privacy became a luxury measured not in philosophy but in inches. The kitchen might also be the bedroom, workshop, nursery and dining room. Garment work was often done at home, which meant cloth, thread, scraps, dust and labour filled the same space where children slept. A mother might sew late into the night by a lamp while a child coughed nearby and another family member tried to sleep before work. Food smells mixed with coal smoke, damp clothing, human breath, and the odours rising from shared toilets or backyard privies. Water might have to be carried. Stairs were steep, hallways dark. Fires were a constant fear. Disease moved easily when people had little space and less sanitation. Tuberculosis, cholera outbreaks earlier in the century, typhoid, diphtheria, infant mortality, all of these haunted the crowded city. Jacob Riis, the journalist and photographer whose 1890 work How the Other Half Lives shocked many middle-class readers, used words and images to expose conditions that had been visible all along to the people living inside them. That is worth remembering. The tenements were not hidden because no one could find them. They were hidden because many people with comfort had learned not to look. Riis brought a camera and a flash into rooms that polite society could not easily dismiss afterward. Children sleeping in corners, men crowded into lodging houses, families living in spaces where light barely entered. His work was reform-minded and sometimes carried the prejudices of his age, but it forced a question into public life. What did it mean for one half of a city to live like this, while the other half dressed for dinner under chandeliers? The answer was not simple charity, though charity came. Settlement houses, missions, churches, reform organisations and philanthropic societies all moved through the urban poor districts with varying mixtures of compassion, control, religious purpose, social anxiety, and genuine practical help. But the tenement problem was not simply that poor people lacked kindness from the rich. The problem was structural. Wages were low, work was unstable, rent consumed too much, housing laws were weak or poorly enforced. Immigrants had limited options. Political machines offered assistance in exchange for loyalty. Landlords profited. Employers benefited from a labour force desperate enough to accept long hours and low pay. A crowded room was not an accident. It was the final result of many decisions made by people who did not have to sleep there. This is where the comparison with the mansion becomes most revealing. The rich also lived in rooms designed by other people, but their rooms were designed around comfort, privacy, ceremony, and control. Poor families lived in rooms designed around yield. How many rents can one building produce? How little light can satisfy the law? How many bodies can share a pump, a privy, a hallway, a stove? In one world, architecture protected the individual from inconvenience. In the other, architecture exposed the individual to everyone else's need. A wealthy child might have a nursery, a governess, a schedule, toys imported from Europe, and a bed that belonged only to them. A tenement child might sleep beside siblings, parents, boarders, sewing bundles, cooking pots, and the constant noise of the building. Yet it would be a mistake to describe tenement life only as misery. People built culture there. They argued, cooked, prayed, saved money, formed mutual aid societies, learned English, preserved old languages, opened small shops, sent children to school when they could, celebrated weddings, mourned deaths, and created neighbourhoods with loyalties as strong as any mansion family's pride. The tenements were crowded and often dangerous, but they were also places of adaptation and endurance. Immigrant mothers stretched food, fathers searched for work, children translated for parents, neighbours watched one another's babies, and communities formed around synagogues, churches, saloons, markets, street vendors, and schools. The street itself became an extension of the home because the rooms were too small to contain life. Children played outside not because the street was safe, but because inside was full. Vendors shouted, horses passed, laundry hung overhead, news travelled quickly, so did gossip, so did illness, so did opportunity when it appeared. A boy might run errands and learn the city. A girl might carry bundles of finished garments to a contractor. A family might save enough to move to a better building, or a small business might begin in a pushcart and grow into a shop. These stories mattered. They were real. But they did not cancel the hardship, just as a mansion library did not cancel the factory conditions that helped pay for it. The Gilded Age constantly asks us to resist easy cancellation. It asks us to see the achievement and the cost in the same frame. The wealthy built institutions and also built walls. The poor suffered exploitation and also built lives of skill, memory, and community. The city was not one thing. It was many things stacked on top of one another, and the stacks were not equal. At night the contrast sharpened. In a mansion, evening could be managed, lamps lit in sequence, dinner announced, courses served, music arranged, guests received, the temperature adjusted, the rooms moved from public display to private retreat. In a tenement, evening was not so easily shaped. Work often came home, noise came through the walls, a crying baby could wake 3 families, a drunk boarder could make a room unsafe, a stove might smoke, a lamp might be too expensive to burn for long, someone might still be sewing, someone might be ill, someone might be counting wages against rent and realizing there was not enough. The rich had evenings that could be curated. The poor had evenings that had to be survived, though sometimes they also contained laughter, songs, card games, gossip, prayer, and the stubborn human habit of making warmth wherever possible. I want you to picture both scenes without turning either into a symbol too quickly. In one room, a servant removes plates from a dining table, while guests speak softly over wine, and the silver catches the light. In another, a woman lifts a pot from a small stove in a crowded kitchen, and divides food carefully because tomorrow's money is uncertain. In one room, a girl learns which families are acceptable and which invitations matter. In another, a child learns which stair creaks, which neighbour can be trusted, which landlord must be avoided, and which factory bell means an older sibling will soon be home. In one house, silence is a feature of wealth. In the other, noise is the proof that everyone is still there. Both rooms belong to the same America. That is the unsettling thing. The Gilded Age did not create inequality from nothing, but it made inequality more visible, more concentrated, and more dramatic. It gave the rich new ways to display wealth, and gave the poor new forms of crowded urban struggle. It produced a landscape where one could ride in a carriage from a ballroom to a district of packed tenements, in less time than it takes many of us to commute to work, and yet the moral distance between the two places seemed vast enough that people built entire philosophies to explain it away. Some said the poor lacked discipline, some said the rich were chosen by natural competition, some said charity would soften the rough edges, some said immigrants simply needed time, some said government should intervene, some said intervention would ruin liberty. Underneath all these arguments, rent came due, wages were paid or cut, children grew, workers aged early, rich families married, divorced, inherited and built again. The walls remained, and behind the walls the work continued. The mansion required servants, the tenement supplied them, the mansion required coal, men mined it, men. It required food, farmers shipped it by rail. It required dresses. Women sewed them. It required steel, glass, stone, lumber, silver, carpets, furniture, and the labour of countless people who would never be invited past the formal entrance except through a service door. Once you see that, the mansion stops being only a beautiful object. It becomes a map of labour. Every polished surface points outward to someone's hands. Every grand staircase depends on a quarry, a workshop, a ship, a railroad, a deliveryman, a maid with a cloth, a cook below stairs, a laundress with cracked skin. The tenement, too, becomes more than a place of poverty. It becomes the crowded human reservoir from which the city drew its strength every morning. Before dawn, people descended those stairs and went out into factories, kitchens, laundries, docks, construction sites, shops, mills, and street trades. They carried the city on their bodies. And if we want to understand what the Gilded Age truly cost, we have to follow them out of those rooms, through the early streets, toward the whistle, the gate, the time clock, and the long working day that waited on the other side. Before the city was fully awake, the working day had already begun for the people who made it run. The streets outside the tenements filled in the grey edge before morning, when the air still held the damp smell of ash, horse manure, yesterday's garbage and coal smoke that never quite left the city. Doors opened, boots came down wooden stairs, Lunch pails were lifted from tables, women wrapped shawls around their shoulders, men buttoned coats that had been patched more than once. Children old enough to work, and some who were not really old enough at all, stepped into the street with the sleepy seriousness of people who had learned early that tiredness did not excuse absence. The factory bell, the mill whistle, the mine shift, the dock call, the shop opening, all of them were waiting. A person could be hungry, ill, grieving, pregnant, injured, or simply worn down from the day before, and still the bell would ring at the same hour. That was one of the new realities of the Gilded Age. Time itself had been reorganised. Farm work had always been hard, often brutally hard, but it followed the weather, the season, the animals, the light, the cycle of planting and harvest. Factory work followed the clock. The clock did not care if the sun had risen cleanly, or if the air outside was thick with winter fog. It did not care if a child had been coughing through the night, if a wife had been awake sewing until midnight, if a man's hands were still swollen from yesterday's labour. The clock had become part of the machinery. In some ways, it was the first machine a worker encountered every day. It told him when to arrive, when to begin, when to stop, when to eat, when to return, and when he had failed. Being late was not a small social mistake. It could cost wages. It could cost a job. It could mark a worker as unreliable in a city where another desperate person was often waiting outside the gate. I want you to imagine that gate for a moment, because it explains more about the age than many speeches do. On one side is the street, crowded, noisy, uncontrolled, full of vendors, wagons, languages, arguments, children, dogs, mud, and chance. On the other side is the factory yard, where time has been narrowed into production. The worker passes through and becomes, for the length of the shift, part of a system designed around output. This did not mean workers had no skill. Many had great skill. A steel worker, a machinist, a glassblower, a printer, a cigar maker, a seamstress, a railroad mechanic, a miner. All of them could possess knowledge that took years to acquire, and that no owner could simply wish into existence. But the Gilded Age factory had a way of taking skill and surrounding it with pressure. Produce more, work faster, accept less control, stand closer to danger, repeat the same motion until the body remembers it better than the mind does. The promise was wages, steady wages if you were fortunate, and wages mattered because the city ran on cash. Rent had to be paid in cash, coal had to be bought, food had to be bought, shoes, medicine, burial fees, school books, church dues, streetcar fares, all of them turned life into a chain of small payments. The loss of 1 week's wages could shake an entire household. The loss of a job could mean taking in more boarders, pulling a child from school, pawning a coat, skipping meat, moving to a worse room, or falling behind with a landlord who did not need a long explanation. So workers went. They went when the work was dangerous. They went when the air was bad. They went when they knew the owner would never learn their names. The price of a day was not only the hours spent inside the building, it was the strength left there, the hearing dulled by noise, the lungs filled with dust, the fingers scarred, the back bent, the patience consumed, the childhood shortened, the family evening made quieter because there was simply not enough energy left for tenderness. In the steel districts around Pittsburgh, the price could be seen in fire. The mills did not merely operate, they roared. Furnaces burned with a heat that turned night strange, lighting the sky with an orange glow that could make whole neighbourhoods feel as if they lived beside a permanent emergency. Men worked around molten metal, rolling rails, handling ingots, feeding furnaces, moving through noise so constant that ordinary conversation had to be shouted. The work required coordination and courage, but it was often scheduled with a harshness that shocks even people accustomed to hard labour. 12-hour shifts were common in many heavy industries, and in some steel mills the shift could be part of a 2-turn system that kept men tied to the works for stretches that left little room for anything but eating and sleeping. Sunday was not always guaranteed. The body became organised around the mill. A man might leave home in darkness, return in darkness, and know the changing of the seasons less by the light outside than by the temperature inside the works and the condition of his own hands. Steel paid better than some forms of labour, and that matters. Many workers endured the mills because the wages could support a family better than the alternatives. But better wages did not make the work safe. A man could earn enough to keep food on the table and still stand one accident away from ruin. Industrial injury in the Gilded Age was not rare enough to be surprising. It was part of the background. Machines were exposed. Belts, gears, blades, rollers, presses, and hoists operated in crowded rooms where a sleeve, a loose strand of hair, a momentary slip or a distracted step could mean maiming. Safety devices existed but were not always installed, especially if they slowed production or cost money. Compensation for injury was uncertain and often cruelly limited. The assumption in many workplaces was that risk belonged to the worker. If he was hurt, perhaps he had been careless. If he was killed, perhaps that was unfortunate. The machine, however, continued. This is the coldness that runs beneath the age. It is not always the personal cruelty of one owner sneering at one worker. Sometimes it is colder than that. It is a system in which the death of one man has already been priced as less important than stopping production. In textile mills, the danger had a different sound. Not the thunder of steel, but the relentless clatter of looms and spinning machinery, a noise that filled the room and entered the nerves. Women and children formed a large share of the workforce in many textile centres, especially in earlier mill towns and in garment-related work. The work could look less dramatic than steelmaking, but that does not mean it was gentle. Cotton dust floated in the air. The room could be hot, humid, and poorly ventilated. Workers stood for long hours, tied broken threads, watched machines, carried bobbins, and repeated motions until the body ached in places that never quite healed. Children were valued not because they were strong, but because they were small, quick, and cheap. Small hands could reach where adult hands could not. Small bodies could move under machinery. A child could doff bobbins, sweep floors, carry materials, or perform repetitive tasks for pay that helped keep a family alive. We should be careful when we talk about child labour, because modern outrage can sometimes flatten the choices families faced. Many parents did not send children to work because they were indifferent to childhood. They sent them because rent was due, because food cost money, because a father's wages were not enough, because a mother had lost a husband, because illness had reduced the household income, because the economy did not pay sentiment. But necessity does not make the loss less real. A child in a mill learned punctuality, obedience, fatigue, danger, and the value of pennies before learning what a long free afternoon felt like. The schoolroom, if it appeared at all, had to compete with the factory floor. In coal country, another kind of childhood unfolded underground and around the breakers. Boys worked as breaker boys, separating slate from coal, sitting over chutes where the coal moved past them in a dark stream. Their fingers became cut and blackened. The dust entered their lungs. The work was monotonous, dirty and dangerous, but it fed the mines with sorting labour and fed families with wages. Men underground faced roof falls, explosions, flooding, bad air, and the ordinary exhaustion of cutting and loading coal in cramped spaces. Coal heated the mansions, powered factories, moved trains, and lit the industrial appetite of the nation. The people who extracted it often lived in company towns where the employer owned the houses, the store, and sometimes much of the local authority. In theory, wages were paid. In practice, debt to the company store could bind a family tightly to the place that employed them. The price of a day might be deducted before it reached the kitchen table. Tools, housing, supplies, food, all could be folded into the employer's world. This is another form of control, less elegant than a trust agreement, but just as effective. If a man's job, house and credit all depended on the same company, Then disagreement became expensive. A complaint could threaten shelter. A strike could threaten food. A blacklisted worker might find that he had not only lost one job but been marked across an entire region. The Gilded Age celebrated the freedom of contract, but it is worth asking what freedom means when one side owns the town and the other side owes rent. In garment work, especially in cities like New York, the factory did not always have a single large building. Work could be spread through sweatshops, contractors, and home labour. A manufacturer might distribute work to contractors who pushed the pressure downward to workers paid by the piece. Piecework has its own discipline. Instead of the bell alone, the worker is governed by the number finished. More stitches, more bundles, more cigars rolled, more garments completed, more pay. Slower hands mean less money. Bad light, cramped rooms, aching backs, sick children nearby. None of that changes the rate. Immigrant women often carried this pressure inside the home itself, where domestic space and wage labour blended until there was no clean line between working and living. A kitchen table became a workbench. A child's sleep happened beside unfinished garments. Needles moved late into the night. Contractors could reject work for flaws, reduce pay or shift orders elsewhere. The people at the bottom of the chain bore the uncertainty. Above them, the finished product entered stores and wardrobes, detached from the hands that made it. This detachment is one of the most powerful illusions of industrial life. A shirt appears in a shop. A rail appears beneath a train. A lamp lights with kerosene. A building rises with steel. Each object seems complete, clean, almost neutral. The labour inside it is not visible unless someone insists on looking. The Gilded Age was full of objects whose human cost had been smoothed away by the time they reached the buyer. And yet workers were not simply passive sufferers, moving silently through a world made by others. That would be a false picture. They resisted, negotiated, adapted, organised, argued, slowed down, walked out, formed unions, joined mutual aid societies, attended meetings, read labour newspapers, debated politics, and carried their own understanding of justice into the public sphere. The Knights of Labour grew in the 1880s with a broad vision that included skilled and unskilled workers, men and women, and, at least in principle, workers across divisions that often fractured American life. The American Federation of Labour, led by Samuel Gompers, took a more focused approach, emphasising skilled workers, wages, hours, and working conditions. These organisations did not solve the problem of industrial labour, and they often excluded or failed many workers, especially black workers, Chinese workers, women, and the least skilled. But they show us that working people were thinking carefully about the new economy. They understood that individual bargaining meant little when facing a corporation with lawyers, guards, political allies, and money enough to wait out hunger. Collective action was one answer, though it carried real danger. A worker who joined a union could be fired. A strike could bring police, private detectives, militia, or federal troops. Newspapers might describe strikers as radicals or foreign agitators, even when their demands were painfully ordinary. A shorter day, safer conditions, wages paid fairly, the right to speak together without losing the right to eat. The 8-hour movement became one of the great labour demands of the 19th century. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. That slogan endured because it named something larger than a schedule. It claimed that a worker's life contained more than labour. That may sound obvious now, but it was not obvious inside an economy that measured people by output. To demand time was to demand personhood. To say that the day should have limits was to say that the employer did not own the whole human being. The employers heard that message clearly, which is one reason many fought it so fiercely. They feared not only higher costs but a loss of authority. The factory floor was not a democracy. The owner, manager, foreman and superintendent expected obedience. A worker who challenged the pace challenged more than a clock. He challenged the right of capital to define the terms of life. That is why labour conflict in this period could become so bitter so quickly. It was never only about cents per hour. It was about who had the power to say what a day was worth. To the employer, a day could be broken into productivity, wages, costs, margins, and discipline. To the worker, a day included all of that, but also the walk home, the child waiting, the pain in the shoulder, the missed meal, the fear of injury, the rent due Saturday, the church service, the meeting hall, the sleep that never felt long enough. Both sides used numbers, but they were not counting the same things. The state often claimed to stand above the conflict, neutral and orderly, but workers frequently experienced government as something that arrived when property was threatened. Local police guarded factories. Courts issued injunctions. Governors called out militias. Federal troops sometimes moved to protect rail lines and commerce. The law recognised property with great clarity. It recognised hunger more slowly. This does not mean every official was corrupt or every employer heartless. History is rarely so neat. Some reformers inside and outside government did push for factory inspections, child labour laws, housing reform, shorter hours, and safer workplaces. Some employers adopted welfare programs, company housing, libraries, pensions, or recreational facilities, sometimes out of genuine concern and sometimes to discourage unions. Paternalism could soften life in small ways, while preserving control in larger ones. A company might provide a school and still refuse collective bargaining. It might sponsor a picnic and still cut wages. It might build houses and still evict strikers. The worker was expected to be grateful for what was given, not powerful enough to demand what was owed. That difference matters. It is the difference between charity and rights. One depends on the mood of the giver. The other can be claimed even when the giver is annoyed. By the late 19th century, more Americans were beginning to see that the industrial workplace was not a temporary rough patch on the road to prosperity. It was a permanent feature of the new economy, and if left entirely to the owners, it would arrange itself around profit with only occasional concern for the bodies producing it. The price of a day was visible in accident reports, wage tables, strike notices, death records, and the tired faces moving through factory gates before dawn. It was visible in the way a man sat down after work and said little. It was visible in the child who fell asleep at supper. It was visible in the woman still sewing after everyone else had stopped. It was visible in the crowded street on payday, when wages turned briefly into groceries, rent, medicine, or a pair of shoes that had been delayed too long. What makes this difficult to hold is that the same industrial system also produced real abundance. More goods, cheaper goods, more rail connections, more buildings, more tools, more lamps, more newspapers, more machines, more chances for some people to rise. The worker might resent the factory and still depend on it. A family might hate the hours and still fear losing them. A city might condemn industrial smoke and still need the jobs beneath it. Progress arrived with a bill attached, and the bill was not evenly distributed. The wealth moved upward in great shining streams. The injuries remained personal. A dividend could be divided among investors who never smelled the mill. A mangled hand stayed with one man for life. A wage cut appeared in a boardroom as a sensible adjustment and at home as thinner soup. A new machine increased output and also made older skills less valuable. An economic panic began with credit and speculation, and ended with workers standing outside locked gates. This is why the factory bell is such a useful sound to keep in mind. It seems simple. It marks the beginning of work. But in the Gilded Age, it also marked the transfer of time from the worker to the owner. For the next 10 or 12 hours, sometimes more, a portion of a human life would be converted into profit, wages, goods, and exhaustion. The bell did not ask whether the conversion was fair. It simply rang. And every morning across the country, people answered because they had to. From the tenement stairwells, from boarding houses, from company cottages, from farmhouses near mines, from immigrant neighbourhoods, From streets where the smoke had already settled low, they moved toward the places where America's new wealth was being made. Some carried tools, some carried lunch. Some carried union cards hidden carefully. Some carried only the hope that today would not be the day the machine slipped. The foreman shouted, the wages were cut, the mine roof cracked, or the notice appeared that there was no more work. The factories, mills, mines and workshops gave the Gilded Age its muscle, but they did not stand alone. They depended on coal arriving, iron moving, food reaching cities, finished goods leaving for markets, workers travelling from neighbourhoods to jobs, and money flowing through accounts that stretched far beyond the factory wall. Under nearly all of it ran the rails. The whistle in the distance was not background sound. It was the system calling to itself, carrying materials, people, orders and power across the country, tying the fate of a worker at a machine to the decisions of men who measured America not in streets or rooms, but in routes, rates and miles. The railroads did not simply cross America, they rearranged it. Before the rails, the country was large in a way that was felt physically. Distance had weight. A farmer knew it in the time required to move wheat. A merchant knew it in the uncertainty of delivery. A family moving west knew it in the wheels of a wagon braking. The mud, the river crossing, the weeks of weather that could not be hurried. The railroad changed distance from a fact of nature into a business problem. How many miles of track? How many tons of freight? How many passengers? How many bonds sold to finance the line? How many acres of land granted by the government? How many towns reached, bypassed, charged, or made dependent? To the railroad kings of the Gilded Age, the map was not only a picture of a nation, it was an opportunity sheet. Mountains, rivers, prairies, forests, deserts, towns, farms, ports, mines and markets could all be understood in terms of connection. A place that had once been remote could become valuable if a line reached it. A place that had expected to grow could fade if the track bent another direction. The decision of where to lay rails could make land prices rise before a single engine arrived. Men with information could buy ahead of construction and watch value appear under their feet. A line on a map became wealth before the train ever moved. That is one of the reasons railroads attracted not only engineers and workers, but speculators, bankers, lobbyists, lawyers, and politicians. The railroad was never just a machine. It was a financial organism, a political project, and a private business built through public favours. In the years after the Civil War, no industry in America consumed more attention, more investment, or more imagination. Railroads promised unity. They promised markets. They promised national strength. They promised that the continent could be tied together by iron and timetable. The ceremony at Promontory Summit in Utah in 1869, when the Union Pacific and Central Pacific lines met, and a ceremonial golden spike marked the completion of the first transcontinental railroad, carried enormous symbolic power. Newspapers treated it as the closing of distance itself. Telegraph wires carried news of the event almost instantly. A journey that had once taken months could now be imagined in days. To many Americans, it felt like proof that the nation, recently torn apart by civil war, could be physically stitched together. That image was powerful, and it was not entirely false. The railroad did connect people, markets, and regions in ways that changed ordinary life. But the stitching was not gentle, and the hands doing it were not always the hands that profited. Chinese labourers working for the Central Pacific blasted through the Sierra Nevada, hung from cliffs in baskets, drilled into rock, handled explosives, endured snow, hunger, danger and discrimination, and then were often pushed to the margins of the public memory when the line was celebrated. Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, freedmen in some regions, Mexican workers, and countless others laid track, graded roadbeds, dug, hammered, carried, and died in work that was presented afterward as national destiny. Destiny is a comfortable word when someone else has done the digging. The men who financed and controlled these lines understood the value of patriotic language. A railroad could be described as progress, civilization, union, settlement, and national purpose. It could also be a way to obtain government bonds, land grants, contracts, and political protection. The Union Pacific and Central Pacific received immense federal support, including land and loans, because the nation wanted a transcontinental line badly enough to encourage private companies to build it. That support helped make the project possible, but it also created opportunities for manipulation. The credit mobilia scandal, which erupted publicly in the early 1870s, revealed how insiders connected to the Union Pacific had used a construction company to siphon profits from railroad building, while shares or favours reached members of Congress. To ordinary Americans, the details were complicated, but the smell was clear. The railroad had become a place where public purpose and private enrichment were tangled together so tightly that pulling them apart was nearly impossible. That pattern would repeat across the age. A railroad company asked for help in the name of development. Investors made money. Politicians received support. Towns competed for access. Farmers became dependent on the line. Then the company charged what the traffic would bear. The phrase sounds almost bloodless, but it carried real consequences. A railroad rate could decide whether a farmer earned a profit or slid further into debt. Grain was bulky. Cattle had to move. Cotton, timber, coal, and ore all required transportation. If there was only one practical railroad serving an area, the company did not need to ask politely. It could set rates that seemed to many farmers less like business and more like tribute. The farmer owned the land, planted the crop, endured drought, insect, debt, and price swings. But when harvest came, the railroad stood between him and the market. That position created anger across the Midwest and the plains. Farmers organised through the Grange and later other movements because they understood that independence meant little if every road to market passed through a private toll gate. A man could own his farm and still feel governed by a company office hundreds of miles away. Railroad power entered rural life through freight bills, storage fees, elevator charges, and discriminatory rates that favoured large shippers over small ones. Big customers could receive rebates, secret discounts, or better treatment, allowing them to undercut competitors. Small producers paid the posted rate and wondered why success kept moving out of reach. This was not the old face-to-face economy of a village merchant and a customer arguing over terms. This was a system in which a rate sheet printed far away shaped the fate of families who might never meet the men who wrote it. In the cities, the railroad created another kind of dependence. Factories needed raw materials. Coal had to arrive. Finished goods had to leave. Stockyards depended on rail movement. Grain elevators depended on it. Ports depended on it. Newspapers depended on it. Mail moved by train. People travelled by train. The entire rhythm of commerce began to follow the schedule. In 1883, the major railroads adopted standard time zones in North America, dividing time itself for operational convenience. Before that, towns often kept local time based on the sun, which worked well enough when life moved at the pace of walking, horses, and local exchange. Railroads needed coordination across distance. A few minutes could mean missed connections or collisions. So time was standardized, and eventually the public followed. Think about the significance of that. The railroads did not merely move through American time. They helped define it. The clock in a town could be adjusted because trains required it. That is power of a very practical kind. It enters the school, the shop, the church, the court, the factory, the meal, and the body. When we say railroad, kings measured America in miles and money. We should also add minutes. They measured the nation in units that could be scheduled, billed, financed, and controlled. Cornelius Vanderbilt had shown one version of this power in the East, where controlling lines into New York could make a man dominant. Jay Gould showed another, darker version in the maze of speculation, stock manipulation, and aggressive railroad finance. Gould was not admired in the same way as some other magnates. even by people who admired success. He had a reputation for cold cleverness, for seeing railroads not always as transportation systems to be improved, but as instruments through which money could be extracted. He bought, sold, combined, raided, and manipulated with a patience and nerve that made him both fascinating and hated. To many critics, Gould represented the financial predator in its pure form, a man who could treat railroad workers, passengers, farmers, and investors as pieces in a larger game. Yet to dismiss him as merely dishonest would miss the point. The Gilded Age rewarded men who understood that control of paper could matter as much as control of steel. Stocks, bonds, charters, mortgages, leases, receiverships, and reorganizations could shift power without a single rail being moved. A railroad might be overbuilt, underfunded, loaded with debt, fought over by competing investors, driven into bankruptcy, and then reorganized in ways that left some people ruined and others enriched. The physical railroad remained on the ground. The ownership above it changed hands through documents. The workers still repaired track, the farmers still shipped grain, the passengers still bought tickets. But somewhere in New York, a financial struggle could determine who collected the profit and who bore the loss. This separation between physical labour and financial control is one of the central features of the age. The men laying track sweated over what was solid. The men in offices manoeuvred over claims to that solidity. Both mattered, but only one group usually became famous. James J. Hill offers a different picture, and that difference is useful. Hill built the Great Northern Railway across the Northern Plains without relying on the same kind of federal land grants that had shaped some earlier transcontinental lines. He promoted settlement along his route because empty land did not produce freight. He encouraged farmers, advertised the possibilities of the region, and thought carefully about traffic, grades, and efficient operation. Hill was often presented as the responsible railroad builder, the man who created value rather than merely exploiting subsidies. There is truth in that comparison, but we should not turn it into a fairy tale. His railroads still depended on land, labour, immigrant settlement, resource extraction, and the transformation of native lands into routes for commerce and farming. The Northern Plains were not empty simply because railroad advertisements described them as opportunity. Indigenous peoples had histories, claims, movements, and lives that the railroad age often treated as obstacles to be removed. That is another cost hidden inside the word development. A railroad map can look clean because it does not show who was displaced to make the line feel inevitable. Across the West, railroads accelerated settlement and extraction. They brought farmers, miners, cattlemen, merchants, and soldiers. They moved buffalo hides and cattle, wheat and timber, ore and machinery. They also helped destroy older ways of life by making the movement of goods, people, and military force faster and more organized. The near destruction of the buffalo, the confinement of native nations onto reservations, the division of land into saleable property, and the expansion of markets all moved together with the railroad. To Eastern investors, a railroad into the West might appear as progress measured in mileage. To native communities, it could appear as invasion with a timetable. To settlers, it could mean a chance at land. To speculators, a chance at profit. To railroad managers, a line that had to be fed with freight. One set of tracks carried many meanings depending on where you stood. This is why the railroad story cannot be told only from the boardroom or only from the engine cab. It has to move between them. Stand first in a railroad president's office. There are maps on the wall, letters on the desk, telegrams arriving, men discussing rates, debt, competition, legislation, and expansion. The language is businesslike. Connections, tonnage, bond issues, rights of way through routes, branch lines, terminals. Now stand beside a section gang repairing track in heat or cold, men swinging tools, lifting rails, tamping ballast, keeping the roadbed safe enough for trains carrying other people's profits. Stand in a farm kitchen where a husband and wife calculate whether the freight rate leaves anything after the mortgage payment. Stand at a small town station when the first train arrives and people gather with excitement because the world has come closer. Stand there again years later if the railroad closes a stop, changes a route, or raises rates, and feel how dependent the town has become. The same machine could bring hope and helplessness. That is part of its power. In the passenger cars, Americans encountered class in motion. Wealthier travellers could ride in comfort with upholstered seats, sleeping berths, dining cars, and a degree of insulation from discomfort. Poorer travellers endured harder conditions, crowded cars, smoke, noise, and fatigue. George Pullman built an entire business around the idea that travel could be made elegant for those who could afford it. Pullman cars offered comfort, service, and a sense of refinement on rails. But Pullman's world also depended on workers, including the Pullman porters, many of them black men, who provided service under conditions that required patience, discipline, and endurance in the face of condescension and strict control. Pullman also built a company town near Chicago, designed to house workers in what he considered orderly and improving surroundings. To some observers, it looked like industrial benevolence. To many workers, it felt like control. Rent, rules, wages, conduct, and employment all tied together in one company-dominated environment. When economic depression struck in the 1890s and Pullman cut wages without lowering rents, the anger that followed would help ignite one of the most important labour conflicts in American history. We are not staying there yet, but you can already see the pattern forming. The railroad created not only transportation, but whole worlds of dependency. It tied the employee to the company, the town to the line, the farmer to the rate, the passenger to the schedule, the politician to the donation, and the investor to the bond. It made America faster, but not necessarily freer. That distinction matters. Speed can feel like freedom when you choose it. When it is imposed, it can feel like a new form of pressure. The railroad compressed space, but it also compressed patience. Goods had to move, workers had to arrive, connections had to be made, markets reacted faster. A delay in one region could ripple into another. The economy became more national, more integrated, and more vulnerable to shocks, travelling along the same connections that carried prosperity. A strike on one line could disrupt commerce far beyond the workers who began it. A financial panic tied to railroad debt could shake banks and households that had never seen the tracks in question. America had been connected, and connection brought both strength and fragility. By the late 19th century, the public had begun to demand that railroad power be restrained. State-level efforts, especially in the Midwest, pushed against rates and monopolistic practices. Court cases and political movements wrestled with the question of whether private property used for public necessity could be regulated in the public interest. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 created the first federal regulatory commission, the Interstate Commerce Commission, intended to address railroad abuses. It was a beginning, but not a clean victory. The commission was often weak, limited by courts, resisted by the companies, and forced to move slowly against an industry that had already mastered delay. Still, the act matters because it marked a shift in public thinking. Americans were beginning to admit that the old faith in competition did not work when a company controlled the only practical route. Regulation emerged not because people had stopped believing in business, but because they had seen what happened when business became infrastructure and infrastructure became private power. The railroad kings did not give up easily. They had allies in legislatures, friends in newspapers, lawyers skilled at turning simple complaints into complicated legal disputes, and enough economic importance to make every threat of regulation feel risky. A politician who challenged a railroad could be accused of threatening jobs, settlement, investment, and growth. A newspaper dependent on railroad advertising or favourable shipping might think carefully before attacking too hard. A town hoping for a depot might not want to offend the company deciding where the line would pass. Influence did not always require bribery, sometimes it required only importance. When enough people depend on you, they begin to censor themselves in advance. That is one of the quieter forms of power, and the Gilded Age was full of it. The railroads taught corporations how to be large, how to operate across state boundaries, how to raise capital, how to manage public opinion, how to fight regulation, how to use lawyers, how to standardize systems, how to make the nation adapt to corporate needs and call it progress. Other industries learned from them. Oil learned, steel learned, meatpacking learned, telegraph and finance learned. The modern corporation did not appear fully formed in one moment. It grew through practices that railroads made necessary and profitable. Accounting systems became more complex. Management hierarchies expanded. Middle managers enforced decisions made far above them. Workers encountered the company not as a single owner, they could know personally, but as a structure. A foreman gave an order, a superintendent enforced policy. A payroll office issued wages. A lawyer answered claims. A security force guarded property. The actual owners might be scattered across cities, represented by shares and boards. Responsibility became harder to locate. That was useful. When harm occurred, who exactly had done it? The president, the board, the shareholders, the manager, the market, the competition, the debt. The answer could dissolve into the system, while the injured person remained very solidly injured. Yet it would still be dishonest to say the railroad age was only theft and oppression. Railroads made possible forms of life and commerce that millions embraced. They carried letters, reunions, medicines, newspapers, migrants, fruit, mail-order goods, livestock and ideas. They made national brands possible. They allowed some rural families to buy goods once unavailable. They helped towns grow and connected isolated places to broader markets. People cheered trains because trains mattered. Children ran to see them. Towns celebrated new depots. Businesses formed around them. A train arriving could feel like the future made visible, breathing steam and ringing a bell. The tragedy is not that the railroad was useless. The tragedy is that something so useful became a tool of private domination so often and so easily. The more necessary it became, the more leverage its owners possessed. That is the central lesson. Necessity magnifies power. A luxury can be refused. A necessity must be negotiated with. The railroad kings understood this, whether they said it plainly or not. They measured America in miles because miles could be owned as route. They measured it in money because every route could be converted into rates, bonds, land value, stock price, and political influence. The rest of the country measured the railroad differently. Farmers measured it in the cost of shipping a bushel. Workers measured it in hours and risk. Towns measured it in survival. Immigrants measured it in the distance between the port and the place they hoped to begin again. Native peoples measured it in loss. Politicians measured it in votes, donations, favours and fear. Investors measured it in dividends and collapse. All those measurements existed at once, and above them, in offices heavy with maps and cigar smoke, men made decisions that seemed to belong to business but reached deep into public life. If a railroad could shape a town, influence a legislature, reward a senator, punish a farmer, employ a private police force, and force the federal government to consider how far corporate power should go, then the next question becomes unavoidable. How did a republic built on public authority allow private interests to sit so comfortably inside its political rooms? The answer is not found only on the tracks. It waits in Washington, in state capitals, in hotel suites, in committee hearings, in campaign funds, in railroad passes tucked into pockets, and in the quiet places where money learned to speak the language of law. It rarely sounded like a bribe at first. That is important to understand. The quiet purchase of power usually did not begin with a villain sliding a bag of coins across a table while a senator glanced nervously at the door. Real corruption was often smoother than that, more social, more respectable, and far more difficult to point at. It could look like a campaign contribution offered at the right moment, a railroad pass handed to a politician who travelled often, a consulting arrangement for a friendly lawyer, a speaking invitation with generous expenses, a stock tip given before public news arrived, a committee assignment shaped by men outside the committee, or a bill written in language so technical that only the industry affected by it fully understood its meaning. Power did not always have to shout. In the Gilded Age, it learned to arrive politely. It wore a dark suit, kept careful records when records were useful, avoided records when they were not, and understood that the best influence was the kind that could be described afterward as ordinary business. Washington in the late 19th century was not yet the giant federal capital we know today. The national government was growing, but it was still small compared with the corporate system spreading across the continent. There was no enormous regulatory state with armies of specialists watching railroads, banks, factories, food companies, mining interests, insurance firms, and trusts. Federal power had expanded dramatically during the Civil War, but after the war many Americans still distrusted concentrated government authority, even as concentrated private authority grew larger every year. That mismatch created an opening. The corporations became national before the government fully learned how to govern national corporations. Railroads crossed state lines. Oil moved through networks of production, refining, transport and sale that no single town or state could easily control. Steel, coal, meatpacking, banking, telegraphy and insurance all operated across boundaries. Law, however, often moved more slowly. Jurisdiction mattered. Courts disagreed. Legislatures could be influenced. Regulators, where they existed, lacked staff, money, or authority. Into that gap stepped the men who knew how to make laws bend without always breaking them. A railroad president did not need to own every politician. He needed enough friends, enough confusion, enough delay, enough favourable language, and enough fear of economic disruption to keep regulation weak or manageable. An oil trust did not need to announce that it controlled a market. It could argue that it had made the market efficient, that lower prices benefited consumers, that consolidation was modern and inevitable. A banker could describe his influence as stability. A manufacturer could describe low wages as the discipline of competition. Words mattered because the battle over power was also a battle over what things should be called. A subsidy could be called development. A monopoly could be called efficiency. A strike could be called disorder. A lobbyist could be called a representative of legitimate interests. A donation could be called patriotic support. A captured senator could be called a friend of enterprise. This is one reason the politics of the Gilded Age can feel slippery when you first approach it. There was plenty of plain corruption, but much of the deeper influence operated through respectability. Men did not have to sneak into Washington under cover of darkness. They could arrive by train, stay at a good hotel, dine with lawmakers, attend hearings, speak the language of national prosperity, and leave behind suggestions that would later appear inside bills. The rich did not always stand outside government trying to force their way in. Often they were invited inside because government needed them, feared them, admired them, or depended on the growth they claimed to represent. The Civil War had tied public policy and private profit together through contracts, bonds, railroads, manufacturing, and finance. After the war, that relationship remained. Many politicians genuinely believed that supporting railroads, tariffs, banking stability, and industrial expansion meant supporting the nation. The problem was that the nation and its largest private interests were not the same thing, even when their spokesmen worked hard to make them sound identical. Protective tariffs offer a useful example because they were not as visually dramatic as a strike or a mansion, but they shaped fortunes quietly. Tariffs on imported goods could protect American manufacturers from foreign competition, allowing domestic producers to charge higher prices and grow stronger. Industrialists generally supported them. Workers sometimes supported them too, believing they protected jobs and wages. Consumers, farmers and exporters often saw them differently because tariffs could raise the cost of goods and invite retaliation. A tariff schedule was a dull-looking document, full of categories and percentages, but hidden inside it were winners and losers. A manufacturer might care intensely whether a particular kind of steel, wool, glass, machinery or textile received protection. Lobbyists watched these details closely because a few words could mean profit. The public heard speeches about American industry, national independence and the dignity of labour. Behind the speeches, men calculated margins. This was the quiet work of power. Not everything had to be stolen. Some things could be written into law. Railroads had their own methods. Free passes for politicians and judges became a notorious symbol of influence. But the deeper issue went beyond travel favours. Railroads needed charters, land grants, favourable court decisions, bond support, permission to merge, protection from hostile regulation, and help against labour unrest. They cultivated lawmakers at the federal, state and local levels. State legislatures were especially important because before the 17th Amendment in the 20th century, United States senators were chosen by state legislatures, not directly by voters. That meant railroad and corporate interests could influence the selection of senators through state-level political networks. A Senate seat could become a prize fought over by business factions, party machines and wealthy patrons. The ordinary voter might cast ballots, attend rallies, read campaign posters, and believe he was participating in a Republican government. But somewhere behind the visible process, men with money and organisation could shape which candidates rose far enough to be considered. The Senate of the Gilded Age gained a reputation not entirely unfair as a place where wealth sat comfortably. Some senators were millionaires themselves. Others were closely tied to railroads, mines, banks, or industrial interests. In 1889, a famous political cartoon showed enormous figures labelled as trusts looming over the Senate chamber, their money bags and bodies crowding the room while the people's entrance remained closed. The image struck home because it expressed something many Americans already suspected. The forms of democracy remained. The chamber, the desks, the speeches, the votes, the rules. But behind those forms stood interests too large to pretend away. It is worth pausing over that image because it gives physical shape to a fear that can otherwise seem vague. The fear was not simply that one senator had been bribed. The fear was that the entire room had become accustomed to the presence of money. Once that happens, corruption no longer feels like an exception. It becomes atmosphere. People breathe it and call it normal. The Grant administration earlier in the era had already exposed the public to scandal on a national scale. Ulysses S. Grant himself was personally honest in many ways and carried immense moral authority as the general who had helped win the Civil War, but his presidency became associated with corruption among men around him. The whiskey ring involved fraud by distillers and officials cheating the government out of tax revenue. The Credit Mobilier scandal, tied to railroad construction profits and congressional influence, damaged public trust. The Trade Depot scandal involving Secretary of War William Belknap, who resigned before being impeached by the House, further reinforced the feeling that offices could be treated as property. These scandals mattered not only because money had been taken or favours exchanged, but because they suggested that the federal government, still sacred in the memory of the Union victory, could be handled by men looking for personal profit. That was a hard thing for many Americans to absorb. The same government that had preserved the Union and abolished slavery could also be inhabited by officials and insiders making private bargains. History is often like that. Institutions can do great things and still be vulnerable to grubby human appetite. The Gilded Age did not invent corruption, but it gave corruption new scale because the stakes had grown so large. A local official selling a permit was one thing. A national railroad scandal involving millions in public support and private profit was something else. The size of the economy enlarged the size of temptation. The spoils system made the problem worse. Government jobs were treated as rewards for political loyalty, distributed to party workers after elections. Supporters expected positions. Offices changed hands with administrations. Competence mattered, but loyalty often mattered more. This system created constant pressure for parties to raise money, mobilise voters, and reward allies. It also blurred the line between public service and party machinery. The assassination of President James Garfield in 1881 by a disappointed office seeker shocked the country and helped push civil service reform forward through the Pendleton Act of 1883, which created merit-based exams for certain federal jobs. That reform mattered. It began to professionalise parts of the government and reduce the open distribution of offices as rewards. But it also had an unintended political consequence. As government jobs became less available for party fundraising and loyalty, parties looked even more toward wealthy donors and corporate money. Reform closed one door and left another wide open. That is one of those historical details that feels almost cruel in its logic. An effort to reduce one form of corruption helps strengthen another form of dependence. Campaigns cost money. Newspapers, rallies, travel, posters, organisations and workers all required funding. Wealthy men could provide it, and they did not give without preferences. They might not hand a candidate a list of orders, though sometimes they came close. They did not need to. Politicians usually understood what kind of men had made their campaigns possible. Gratitude, ambition, fear, shared class interests, and future need could accomplish what a written contract would make too obvious. This is the softness of political influence. It often works through anticipation. A senator asks himself what donors will think before donors say anything. A committee delays a bill because delay is safer. A party platform uses strong language in public and leaves the important clauses weak. A president denounces abuses but hesitates when markets tremble. The rich do not always need to command. They can become the weather system inside which political judgment forms. Courts added another layer. The judiciary of the late 19th century often protected property rights, contract rights, and corporate interests with great seriousness. This was partly philosophical. Many judges believed deeply in limited government, freedom of contract, and the sanctity of property. It was also social. Judges often came from the same educated professional world as corporate lawyers and business leaders. They understood the language of capital more readily than the language of industrial desperation. Workers who sought regulation of hours or conditions often ran into legal doctrines that treated their employment contracts as voluntary agreements between equal parties. But how equal was a contract between a hungry worker and a corporation with guards, lawyers, and a payroll office? That question haunted the era. The courts were not blind in the literal sense. They saw contracts. They saw property. They saw injunctions. They saw corporations as legal persons able to claim rights and protections. They were slower to see the unequal bargaining power hidden behind the signed agreement. When labour conflicts erupted, employers increasingly used court injunctions to restrict strikes, boycotts, and picketing. A judge's order could turn a labour tactic into contempt of court. This shifted struggle from the street to the courtroom, where workers faced a language and procedure designed by people far more comfortable with property than protest. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 appears at first glance like a strong response to corporate concentration, and in time it would become an important legal weapon. But in its early years, enforcement was weak and uneven. Courts interpreted it narrowly in some cases, and it was even used against labour unions under the theory that they restrained trade. This is another example of how reform in the Gilded Age often began as a public demand, and then entered institutions that softened, redirected, or delayed it. The law on paper and the law in practice were not the same. The public might celebrate a measure against trusts, while the trusts remained powerful, and workers discovered that the same legal language could be turned against them. Power survives by adapting. If it cannot prevent a law, it influences interpretation. If it loses one battle, it shifts to another venue. If public outrage becomes too loud, it embraces reform in a manageable form. That is why the quiet rooms matter so much. The most important decisions were not always the ones made in the dramatic moments. They were made in committee language, judicial phrasing, administrative weakness, budget limits, appointment choices, enforcement delays, and private conversations before public votes. In Washington hotels, men gathered where conversation could move more freely than on the floor of Congress. The Willard Hotel, the Arlington, private clubs, dining rooms, railroad cars and office suites all served as spaces where business and politics mixed. A lawmaker could meet a railroad attorney over dinner and leave with a clearer sense of what the company considered reasonable. A banker could explain the dangers of unsettling the markets. A manufacturer could warn that wages and jobs depended on protection. A lobbyist could supply technical information that became the foundation of a bill. Information itself was influence. Industries often understood their own operations better than the lawmakers trying to regulate them. That expertise gave them authority, and authority could be used to narrow the imaginable. A company representative did not have to say, "Do not regulate us." He could say, "Regulate us in this particular way, with this exception, this delay, this definition, this commission, this limited penalty, this burden of proof." The result looked like action. It could also be containment. Ordinary citizens had far less access to this process. A worker could vote, sign a petition, attend a rally, or join a union, but he rarely sat in the room where the final language was drafted. A farmer could send letters, organise through the Grange or the Farmers' Alliance and pressure state lawmakers, but the railroad lawyers arrived with arguments, data and relationships already in place. A small business owner hurt by a trust could complain, but the trust had counsel prepared to show that consolidation benefited consumers. Democracy was present, but it was unevenly equipped. The rich could participate as citizens and as financiers, employers, donors, advertisers, litigants, experts, and social equals of lawmakers. The poor usually arrived as numbers, signatures, crowds, or disturbances. This difference shaped how seriously they were heard. When capital spoke, it often sounded informed. When labour spoke, it was often described as emotional. When farmers protested, they were called radical. When corporations demanded favourable policy, they were defending prosperity. The labels did political work. They trained the public to see some claims as responsible, and others as threatening. Yet public anger did not disappear. It moved through newspapers, sermons, reform clubs, farm meetings, labour halls, and eventually political movements. The populists would rise from agrarian frustration with railroads, banks, currency policy, and concentrated power. Urban reformers would expose housing and labour abuses. Journalists would dig into corporate practices and political machines. Ministers would debate the moral meaning of wealth. Working people would organise despite the risks. The quiet purchase of power was never total, but it was persistent enough to shape the field on which every opponent had to stand. That is the difference between influence and dictatorship. The United States did not become a private monarchy. Elections continued. Parties fought fiercely. Reforms passed. Courts sometimes checked corporations. Public opinion mattered. But private money sat close enough to public authority that many Americans wondered whether the forms of self-government were being hollowed out from within. You can hear that worry in the speeches of reformers, the cartoons of the period, the anger of farmers, the demands of workers, and the suspicion directed toward men whose fortunes seemed too large for Republican life. A republic depends not only on ballots, but on the belief that public decisions are made for public reasons. Once people begin to believe that laws are written for donors, that courts hear property more clearly than hunger, that senators belong to railroads, that presidents fear bankers, and that regulation is designed by the regulated, trust thins. The Gilded Age tested that trust severely. It forced Americans to confront a problem the founding generation had not fully imagined in industrial form. What happens when private citizens become powerful enough to rival public institutions without formally holding office? What happens when the richest men can shape laws, markets, wages, transportation, information, and credit, while insisting they are merely exercising liberty? What happens when the language of freedom is used by those with power to resist limits, while those without power are told to be patient? These were not academic questions. They entered daily life. A railroad rate shaped a farmer's mortgage. A tariff shaped the cost of clothing. A court injunction shaped a strike. A campaign donation shaped a senator's silence. A weak commission shaped whether abuses could continue. A government bond deal shaped national finance. Politics was not somewhere far away, though it often felt that way to people shut out of the rooms where decisions were made. Politics was in the pay envelope, the freight bill, the rent, the price of kerosene, the safety rule not passed, the inspection not funded, the monopoly not challenged, the police line outside the factory. By the 1890s, the pressure inside the system was becoming harder to manage. The back rooms could still delay reform, but they could not make anger disappear. Workers had learned that quiet petitions were easily ignored. Farmers had learned that individual complaint could be absorbed. Reformers had learned that exposure alone did not guarantee action, and the economy itself, with its cycles of speculation, overbuilding, debt, and panic, kept revealing how fragile the glittering surface could be. When wages fell, when railroads collapsed, when banks failed, when strikes spread, when troops appeared in the streets, when fires tore through buildings where workers had too few exits and too little power, the private bargains of the age became public consequences. The polished rooms still mattered, but outside them the country was growing louder, and the neck sounds were not the soft voices of lobbyists or the scratch of a pen in committee. They were whistles, marching feet, breaking glass, shouted demands, gunfire, alarm bells, and the crackle of flames beneath the glitter. The first crack in the glitter was not hard to hear if you were standing close enough to the people who paid for it. It sounded like a wage cut. That is the kind of sound history often underestimates because it does not echo like a cannon or ring like a church bell. It arrives on paper. It is posted near a workplace, announced by a manager, printed in a notice, whispered down a line of men who already know what it will mean before the sentence is finished. 10% less. Another reduction. More hours for the same pay. Same hours for less pay. Work available only if you accept the new rate. To an owner, a wage cut could appear in a ledger as adjustment, necessity, market discipline, survival. To a worker, it appeared as rent unpaid, food reduced, coal postponed, a child kept from school, a wife taking in more sewing, a debt extended, a landlord warned off for one more week if warning was still possible. That is why the great labour conflicts of the Gilded Age cannot be understood only as political disturbances. They began in kitchens as much as in union halls. They began when numbers written in offices reached the supper table. A panic on Wall Street might sound distant, but it travelled quickly through the country. A bank failed. A railroad overextended itself. Investors pulled back. Credit tightened. Orders slowed. Mills reduced production. Railroads cut wages. Factories closed gates. Men who had been told that industry was the road to stability discovered that employment in the new economy could vanish with a speed that felt personal even when no one had intended to single them out. The Panic of 1873 began with financial collapse tied to overbuilding, railroad speculation, and the failure of major banking firms, and it pushed the country into a long depression that wounded workers, farmers and businesses across the nation. Railroads, the great symbol of progress, were also deeply entangled in the crisis. Lines had been built too quickly, financed too aggressively, and tied to layers of debt and expectation that could not always be sustained by actual traffic. When confidence broke, the effects moved outward like cold through a wall. For workers, the panic did not mean an abstract contraction in credit. It meant wages cut again and again, while prices did not fall gently enough to make hunger less sharp. By 1877, after years of depression, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad announced another wage reduction, and men who had absorbed too much already stopped absorbing. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 began in West Virginia and spread across the rail network with remarkable speed. That speed mattered. The same tracks that carried freight and passengers now carried news, anger, and example. Workers in one city learned that workers in another had stopped trains, and suddenly the railroad system revealed a vulnerability that owners and politicians could not ignore. If the railroads were the arteries of the nation, striking workers could become a blockage in the body of commerce. In Martinsburg, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis and other places, crowds gathered, trains were halted, yards were occupied, and local authorities often proved unwilling or unable to restore order quickly. Some crowds included railroad workers, others included unemployed men, local residents, sympathizers, boys, onlookers, and people whose anger at hard times found a sudden public form. It was not a single organized movement with one command center. That made it frightening to the authorities. Disorder seemed to appear everywhere at once, and to men of property, the distinction between a strike, a riot, a protest, and a revolution could collapse very quickly. Governors called out militia. In several places, troops fired on crowds. In Pittsburgh, the violence became especially severe after militia from Philadelphia shot into a crowd, killing people and enraging the city. Railroad property was destroyed, buildings burned, cars and engines were wrecked. The smoke over Pittsburgh became a symbol of something larger than one wage dispute. It revealed what could happen when industrial labour, economic suffering, public anger, and state force met in the open. The federal government sent troops to restore order. Business leaders and many newspapers described the events as lawlessness. Workers and their sympathizers saw something else. A government far more willing to protect railroad property than to protect families from starvation wages. This perception would not go away. It settled into working class memory. The Great Railroad Strike was eventually crushed, but crushing a strike is not the same as answering the questions that produced it. The trains moved again. Wages remained a source of conflict. The Depression continued to leave scars, and Americans had seen, perhaps more clearly than before, that the industrial system could bring the country to a halt when those who operated it refused to continue. That knowledge frightened the wealthy. It also gave workers a sense of their own strategic power, even when the price of using it was high. After 1877, employers built stronger defences. They hired guards, kept lists of troublemakers, used spies, relied on courts, and expected government support when property was threatened. Workers, meanwhile, organised in new ways, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly, sometimes across lines of craft and ethnicity, sometimes divided by those same lines in ways employers could exploit. The 8-hour movement grew because the length of the working day remained one of the most immediate and exhausting issues in industrial life. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. It sounds simple. It was not treated as simple. To employers, reducing hours could mean higher costs, less control, and a dangerous concession to labour power. To workers, it meant the possibility of a life not swallowed whole by the workplace. In 1886, the demand for the 8-hour day helped bring hundreds of thousands of workers into action across the country. Chicago became one of the centres of that agitation. It was a city of industry, immigration, politics, police tension, radical organising, and enormous inequality. The McCormick Reaper Works had been the site of labour conflict, and on May 3rd, police fired on workers outside the plant, killing several. The next evening, a protest meeting was held at Haymarket Square. It began peacefully. Speeches were made. The crowd thinned as rain threatened. Then, as police moved to disperse the meeting, someone threw a bomb. It exploded among the officers. Police fired into the crowd. Officers and civilians died. The event became known as the Haymarket Affair, and its consequences reached far beyond the people actually present that night. The identity of the bomb thrower was never firmly established, but several anarchists and labour radicals were arrested, tried, and convicted in a proceeding that many later regarded as deeply unjust, based more on their political beliefs and speeches than direct evidence of throwing the bomb. Some were executed. One took his own life. Others were imprisoned and later pardoned by Illinois Governor John Peter Altgeld in 1893, a decision that damaged his political career, but acknowledged the unfairness of the trial. Haymarket had a devastating effect on the labour movement, especially on public perception. To many middle-class Americans and employers, labour radicalism now seemed tied to bombs, foreign ideologies, and threats to order. The word anarchist became a powerful weapon. It could be used not only against actual anarchists, but against workers demanding better hours or safer conditions. Fear narrowed sympathy. Employers understood this. If a strike could be painted as the beginning of chaos, public support might shift quickly toward repression. Workers understood it too, and many labour leaders, including Samuel Gompers of the American Federation of Labour, worked hard to distance organised labour from revolutionary politics. But the underlying conditions did not disappear because the public became frightened. The workday was still long. The mills were still dangerous. Wages still rose and fell with decisions made far above the worker. In Homestead, Pennsylvania, the conflict became brutally clear. Homestead was a steel town, and the steel works there belonged to Carnegie Steel. Andrew Carnegie was away in Scotland during the famous confrontation of 1892, but his chairman, Henry Clay Frick, was very much present in policy and temperament. Frick was disciplined, hard, and determined to break the strength of the amalgamated association of iron and steel workers at the Homestead plant. The dispute involved wages, union power, and control over the workplace. To the company, the union limited managerial authority. To the workers, the union was one of the few defences they had against being reduced to replaceable hands under the command of capital. Frick prepared for conflict by erecting a high fence around the mill, a structure workers bitterly called Fort Frick. When negotiations failed and workers were locked out, the company brought in Pinkerton agents by barge on the Monongahela River. That detail is worth sitting with because it tells you how much the workplace had come to resemble contested territory. Private armed men floated toward an industrial town in the dark, hired by a private company to take control of a plant from its own workers. When the Pinkertons arrived in July 1892, violence erupted. Gunfire was exchanged. Men were killed and wounded. The workers and townspeople eventually forced the Pinkertons to surrender, a dramatic and humiliating moment for the company. For a short time, it looked as if the workers had won. But the state militia arrived soon after, thousands strong, and took control. The plant reopened with strikebreakers. The union was defeated at Homestead, and organised labour in the steel industry suffered a blow that lasted for decades. Carnegie's reputation never fully escaped the stain. He had written about the duties of wealth, about harmony between capital and labour, about the moral responsibilities of the rich. Yet, when the test came at Homestead, the company he had built chose a course that left blood on the ground and the union broken. This is one of those moments when the Gilded Age refuses to stay clean. The same man could fund libraries and preside over a system that treated worker organisation as an enemy to be crushed. The same public could admire philanthropy and recoil from violence without always connecting them as firmly as they should. Homestead also revealed the limits of worker power when the company, the courts, private force and state power aligned. Workers could occupy a town, rally families, defend gates, and win a confrontation with hired guards, yet still lose when the militia arrived and the broader machinery of authority moved against them. The lesson was not subtle. Property had armies available to it. Labour had courage, numbers and hunger, but courage was not always enough. 2 years later, the Pullman strike of 1894 showed how quickly labour conflict could become national when railroads were involved. The Panic of 1893 had struck the country with terrible force. Railroads failed, banks collapsed, unemployment rose sharply. Families who had lived carefully found themselves suddenly without wages. Coxey's army, a march of unemployed workers led by Jacob Coxey, travelled to Washington in 1894 to demand federal public works jobs, only to be met with arrest and dismissal. The Depression exposed the thinness of security in industrial America. At the Pullman Company town near Chicago, George Pullman cut wages as orders declined, but rents in the company-owned housing remained high. Workers felt trapped inside a system that controlled both their income and their living costs. They struck. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, supported them through a boycott of trains carrying Pullman cars. Because Pullman cars were attached to trains across the country, the boycott spread through the rail system and disrupted national commerce. The federal government intervened, citing interference with the mail and interstate commerce. An injunction was issued. Federal troops entered Chicago. Violence followed. Workers died. Debs was arrested and imprisoned. The strike collapsed. Again, the public lesson was sharp. When labour action threatened the movement of commerce, the government could move with speed and force. Employers could describe intervention as the defence of order. Workers could describe it as the defence of corporate power by public arms. Both sides understood that the railroads made labour struggle national. A strike in one company town could become a crisis across states because the industrial system was interconnected. That interconnection had been praised as progress. During a strike, it became a reason for repression. Panics gave these conflicts their deeper setting. The Panic of 1873 and the Panic of 1893 were not minor interruptions. They were reminders that the Gilded Age economy, for all its confidence, was unstable. Railroads overbuilt, companies borrowed heavily, banks extended credit, investors speculated. When confidence failed, the consequences fell unevenly. Men who had made fortunes might lose money but still dine well. Workers lost wages and sometimes homes. Farmers, already squeezed by debt and falling crop prices, faced foreclosure. Urban families took in boarders, pawned belongings, or joined lines for relief. The language of markets could make suffering sound impersonal, as if no one had chosen it. But the structure of the economy had been built by choices: loose speculation, weak regulation, aggressive expansion, wages treated as flexible, and relief left largely to charities, local governments, churches, and families already under strain. The federal government did not yet see unemployment as a national responsibility in the way later generations would debate it. If a man had no work, he was often expected to search harder, move elsewhere, accept lower pay, or endure. The moral burden rested heavily on the individual even when the cause was systemic. That mismatch produced anger, shame, and desperation. A panic could empty a factory not because workers had failed, but because credit had failed. Yet the worker still carried the humiliation home. Fire, too, belonged to the underside of the glitter. Some fires were spectacular urban disasters, like the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, which remade a city and revealed the vulnerability of crowded wooden streets and buildings. But in the working world, fire was also a daily risk, smaller in scale until suddenly it was not. Tenements burned, workshops burned, factories filled with fabric, dust, chemicals, oil, wood, paper, or poor wiring could become traps. Exits were inadequate. Doors could be locked or blocked. Stairwells were narrow. Fire escapes, when present, could be flimsy or hard to reach. Workers were often expected to trust that nothing would go wrong in buildings designed more for profit than safety. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 would come just beyond the usual boundary of the Gilded Age in the Progressive era, but it belonged to the world the Gilded Age had made. Young garment workers, many of them immigrant women, died because the building, the rules, the exits, and the priorities of industry had failed them. When people later demanded reform, they were not reacting to an isolated accident. They were reacting to decades in which the risk had been known, tolerated, and pushed downward onto those least able to refuse it. Even before Triangle, workers lived with the awareness that the building around them might not protect them. The glittering city required lamps, fabric, furniture, newspapers, cigars, shoes, machinery, food, and clothing, and all of those goods passed through workplaces where safety often depended on whether safety interfered with production. This is the pattern again. The benefit rose outward, polished and purchasable. The risk remained close to the worker. A wealthy woman might wear a dress sewn in a crowded shop, where a lamp flame, a scrap pile, and a locked door could turn ordinary labour into disaster. A banker might invest in a railroad whose wage cuts ignited conflict far from his dining room. And family might heat a mansion with coal dug by men whose lungs darkened in the process. A newspaper reader might condemn strikers as violent, while reading by light made affordable through systems of control and extraction. The Gilded Age connected people who did not want to see their connection. That is part of why its conflicts became so bitter. Workers were told they were part of the nation's progress, but when they protested the cost of that progress, they were treated as threats to it. Farmers were told railroads opened markets, but when they complained about rates, they were told they did not understand business. Immigrants were told America offered opportunity, but when they organised in languages other than English, they were called foreign radicals. The rich were praised for building, but the people who physically built were expected to remain grateful. Gratitude becomes difficult when the pay envelope shrinks. It becomes impossible when the men who cut wages also lecture the poor about thrift. In the years between 1877 and the mid-1890s, America saw enough strikes, panics, protests, and violent confrontations that the old language of inevitable harmony between labour and capital began to sound dishonest, even to many who wanted to believe it. Ministers began to ask harder questions. Journalists dug more deeply. Reformers studied housing, factories, wages, and political corruption. Some middle-class Americans feared disorder more than injustice, but others began to understand that disorder was often the sound injustice made after being ignored too long. The wealthy built armories in some cities partly because strikes and unrest had made them nervous. Private police and detective agencies found work in labour conflict. Workers held meetings where they debated whether unions, political parties, cooperatives, strikes, or more radical action offered the best path forward. The populist movement gathered strength among farmers angry at railroads, banks, deflation, and debt. Socialists and anarchists found audiences among workers who had lost faith in ordinary politics. The American Federation of Labour pursued practical gains for skilled workers, while broader visions of labour solidarity struggled against ethnic divisions, racial exclusion, employer resistance, and public fear. Nothing was simple. The working class was not united in one mind. The rich were not united in one method. Reformers did not agree with one another, but the pressure was undeniable. The glitter had not disappeared, but more people could smell smoke underneath it. There is an image I keep returning to when thinking about this period. Not the mansion ballroom, though that matters. Not the Senate chamber, though that matters too. I think of a worker standing outside a closed gate during a strike or a shutdown, looking at the place where he gives his strength and being told that for now he may not enter unless he accepts terms decided without him. Behind him is his family's need. In front of him is the company's property. Somewhere far away are investors waiting for returns. Somewhere in the middle are politicians deciding whether to call troops, judges considering injunctions, editors choosing adjectives, and respectable people discussing order over breakfast. The worker's body is the place where all those decisions meet. That is the hidden centre of the Gilded Age. Not gold, not marble, not the rich man's portrait. The body of the person who absorbs the cost. When that body refuses, the whole system notices. It noticed in 1877 when trains stopped. It noticed in 1886 when the 8-hour demand filled the streets and Haymarket turned fear into a national weapon. It noticed in 1892 when Homestead became a battlefield. It noticed in 1894 when Pullman cars pulled a company town's grievance into the national rail network. It noticed every time a fire exposed the difference between a workplace designed for production and one designed for human escape. By the end of the century, the country had not resolved these conflicts, but it had been forced to admit they existed. That admission mattered. The old confidence, the easy belief that wealth naturally proved virtue and that markets would arrange society fairly if left alone, had been badly damaged. Americans had seen millionaires require soldiers. They had seen progress require child labour. They had seen philanthropy beside poverty, law beside favouritism, opportunity beside locked exits. The surface still shone, but now the cracks were visible enough that no amount of polish could make them disappear completely. And once a society begins to see the cracks, a new struggle begins, not only over money or wages or rates, but over memory itself. Who will be blamed? Who will be praised? Who will be called dangerous? Who will be called visionary? Who will be remembered as a builder? And who will be remembered only as a crowd? The Gilded Age was moving toward its ending, but not as a curtain dropping in one clean motion. It ended the way such ages usually end, unevenly, with reform and resistance, exposure and denial, new laws and old habits, wealthy men recasting themselves as benefactors, and ordinary people still asking whether the country belonged to those who worked in it, or those who owned the largest pieces of it. The Golden Curtain did not fall all at once. There was no single morning when Americans woke up, looked at the mansions, the trusts, the railroads, the tenements, the strikebreakers, the Senate seats, the factory gates, and agreed that the old arrangement was finished. History rarely gives people that kind of clean signal. What happened instead was slower, messier, and more human. The shine remained, but more people had learned to see what was behind it. The word progress no longer worked as easily as it once had. A railroad could still be praised for connecting a town to the world, but people now asked who set the rates. A steel company could still be admired for building bridges and skyscrapers, but people now asked who paid with 12-hour shifts and broken bodies. A millionaire could still donate a library, but people now asked why the men in his mills could barely afford rest. A senator could still give speeches about liberty, but people now asked whose money had helped put him in that chamber. The change was not that America stopped admiring wealth. It did not. The change was that wealth had to answer more questions than before. That may sound modest, but in a country where rich men had spent decades being treated as the natural winners of history, even being questioned was a serious disturbance. By the turn of the 20th century, the Gilded Age had produced so many visible contradictions that a new generation of reformers, journalists, lawyers, ministers, workers, farmers, and politicians began pulling at the curtain from different directions. They did not always agree with one another. Some wanted to save capitalism from its own worst habits. Some wanted to regulate corporations, not destroy them. Some wanted stronger unions, some wanted cleaner cities, safer food, honest elections, public ownership, women's suffrage, child labour restrictions, or a tax system that placed a greater burden on those who had gained the most. Some were middle-class reformers worried about disorder. Some were radicals who believed the entire industrial system was built on exploitation. Some were wealthy people troubled by the conditions their own class had tolerated. Some were workers who had no interest in theory and simply wanted a shorter day, safer machines, and enough wages to live without begging. The important thing is that the old answer, leave business alone and prosperity will lift everyone, had become harder to defend with a straight face. Too many photographs showed children in mills. Too many investigations revealed families packed into airless rooms. Too many strikes had required troops. Too many scandals had shown corporations reaching into government. Too many panics had taken work from men who had done nothing wrong except depend on an economy run by people who called themselves practical. The country had been forced to look at itself under harsher light. Journalists played a major role in that change. Later critics would call them muckrakers, a word President Theodore Roosevelt used with some irritation, suggesting that they focused too much on filth and not enough on higher things. But the filth was real, and someone had to point to it. Ida Tarbell investigated Standard Oil with a patience and precision that made corporate power legible to ordinary readers. She did not simply shout that Rockefeller was bad. She showed methods, agreements, pressure, rebates, consolidation, and the long process by which one company could come to dominate an industry. Lincoln Steffens exposed municipal corruption and the relationship between business and political machines in city after city. Upton Sinclair entered the meatpacking world of Chicago, intending to awaken the public to the suffering of workers, and his novel The Jungle instead horrified many readers most immediately, with its descriptions of contaminated food. Sinclair later remarked that he had aimed at the public's heart and hit it in the stomach. That detail says something sharp about reform. People often moved faster when their own dinner table seemed threatened than when workers suffered out of sight. Still, the result mattered. Public anger helped push the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. The federal government was beginning to enter areas of life that earlier generations had often left to private business, state authority, or local custom. Food, drugs, rail rates, trusts, workplace safety, housing, banking, and elections all became subjects of national debate in new ways. This was not because Americans suddenly stopped believing in individual effort. It was because individual effort had proved too weak against systems designed to overpower it. A worker could be careful and still be killed by an unsafe machine. A farmer could work hard and still be crushed by freight rates and debt. A consumer could be frugal and still buy adulterated food. A voter could mark a ballot and still find that money had done its work long before election day. Reform grew from the recognition that personal virtue alone could not solve structural problems. That recognition did not come easily. It had to be forced into public life by evidence, organising, scandal, disaster, and exhaustion. Theodore Roosevelt became one of the public faces of this shift, though he was never the enemy of wealth in the simple way some later retellings suggest. Roosevelt believed in order, vigour, national strength, and a moral version of capitalism in which great fortunes could exist, but had to accept public responsibility. He did not oppose all large corporations. He opposed what he considered bad trusts, the corporations that used unfair methods, corrupted government, or threatened the public interest. His administration's case against the Northern Securities Company, a railroad holding company tied to powerful men, including J.P. Morgan and James J. Hill, sent a clear message that the federal government would no longer automatically step aside when financiers combined major systems. Morgan reportedly expected that disputes among gentlemen could be settled privately. Roosevelt insisted that the government had a role. That disagreement captured the change in the air. A banker who had grown used to arranging order from his library now faced a president willing to say that public authority could stand above private arrangement. The victory against Northern Securities in 1904 did not dismantle corporate capitalism. It did not make the United States equal. It did not remove money from politics, but it mattered because it altered expectations. The government could challenge the great combinations. It could ask whether size had become danger. It could tell men who considered themselves indispensable that the law was not merely an inconvenience for smaller people. Later, Standard Oil would be broken up in 1911 under the Sherman Antitrust Act, long after the company had become a symbol of monopoly. The breakup did not impoverish Rockefeller. In some ways, the value of the separate companies made him even richer. That is another reminder not to turn reform into fantasy. Regulation could check power without undoing the fortunes already made. Still, the legal and political meaning was important. The country had declared that private efficiency was not the only standard by which industry would be judged. A company could be too powerful, a method could be too coercive, a market could require public rules. These ideas seem ordinary now only because people fought to make them ordinary. The same shift appeared in railroad regulation. The Interstate Commerce Commission, weak at first, gained more authority over time, especially through laws such as the Hepburn Act of 1906, which strengthened federal power over railroad rates. Again, this did not create perfect fairness. Railroads remained powerful. Lawyers found openings, enforcement remained difficult. But the old assumption that a railroad could charge, discriminate, combine, and pressure with little federal interference was being challenged. Farmers and shippers had spent decades complaining that the railroad stood between them and survival. Now the federal government was beginning to accept that transportation was not just private property. It was public necessity. That concept, once admitted, could not be easily contained. If railroads were public necessity, what about food safety? What about banking? What about workplace conditions? What about housing? The progressive era did not answer every question well, and it often carried its own prejudices, exclusions, and blind spots, especially regarding race, immigration, empire, and the limits of whose suffering reformers considered urgent. But it did mark a shift away from the easy confidence of the Gilded Age. Government became more active, investigation became a tool, expertise became important, regulation became thinkable. Ordinary people, through unions, farm movements, settlement houses, suffrage organisations, reform clubs, and political campaigns, forced issues into public view that wealth would have preferred to leave private. Some reforms reached the Constitution itself. The 16th Amendment, ratified in 1913, allowed a federal income tax, creating a new way to draw revenue from income, including high incomes, rather than relying so heavily on tariffs and other sources that burdened consumers. The 17th Amendment, also ratified in 1913, provided for direct election of United States senators, weakening the old state legislature route through which corporate influence had so often operated. The Federal Reserve System, created that same year, responded to the recurring financial panics that had shown the danger of leaving national monetary stability too dependent on private bankers improvising rescues. These changes came after the classic Gilded Age, but they were responses to its problems. They were the morning after, when the house is still smoky, and everyone begins arguing about who left the lamp too close to the curtains. The country woke changed, but not purified. That distinction matters. The old fortunes did not vanish. The families remained. The institutions funded by Gilded Age money continued to grow. Universities, libraries, museums, foundations, concert halls, and public projects bore the names of men whose business methods had once provoked anger. This is one of the strangest legacies of the age. The same names that appeared in stories of monopoly, strike-breaking, exploitation, and political influence also appeared carved into stone above reading rooms and research laboratories. Carnegie libraries opened doors for people who might never have owned many books. Rockefeller philanthropy funded medical research and education on a historic scale. Vanderbilt, Morgan, Stanford, and others left marks on transportation, finance, universities, art, and public life. It would be too simple to say the gifts were meaningless. They were not. Real people benefited from them. Children read in those libraries. Patients benefited from scientific advances. Students entered institutions shaped by private wealth. But it would also be too simple to let the gifts wash the money clean. Philanthropy can do good and still leave questions unanswered. Who decides what the public needs when private fortunes fund public goods? Why should a society depend on the generosity of men who first gained the power to decide what generosity would look like? Does giving back settle the matter if the taking was built into wages, rates, prices, and political influence? The Gilded Age left America with those questions, and they have not disappeared. They return whenever a billionaire funds a hospital wing, a school, a space project, a media platform, a political campaign, or a foundation aimed at solving problems that may have been worsened by the same economic system that produced the fortune. That is why this story does not feel distant, even though the clothes, trains, factories and manners belong to another century. The details have changed. The question remains recognisable. How much power should private wealth have in a democracy? By the time the Golden Curtain had fallen, America had become a different country from the one that entered the decades after the Civil War. It was more urban, more industrial, more connected, more regulated, more unequal in some ways, more aware of inequality in others. It had built corporations of enormous scale and then begun learning how difficult it was to restrain them. It had welcomed millions of immigrants and also treated many of them with suspicion, discrimination, and harshness. It had produced massive wealth and deep poverty, public reform and private resistance, technological wonder and social damage. It had learned that markets could build quickly, but repair slowly. It had learned that a nation could become rich without becoming fair. It had learned that democracy required more than ballots if economic power became large enough to shape the choices before the voting even began. That lesson was not written in one law or one speech. It was written in the Pullman workers' rent, the homestead fence, the railroad farmer's freight bill, the tenement child's cough, the Senate cartoon, the Standard Oil ledger, the Newport ballroom, the Pittsburgh furnace, the Chicago stockyard, and the government commission struggling to regulate a company whose lawyers had already anticipated the next move. Still, something had shifted. The worship of the self-made millionaire had become less innocent. Americans could still admire success, but they had seen the machinery around it. They had seen that some ladders were pulled up, some markets rigged, some laws influenced, some risks assigned to those least able to bear them. They had also seen that pressure from below could matter. Workers lost many battles, but they forced labour into national discussion. Farmers did not get every reform they wanted, but they changed the language of politics. Journalists exposed what had been hidden. Reformers turned sympathy into policy, unevenly and imperfectly, but not without consequence. The people who suffered under the Gilded Age were not merely background figures in a story about rich men. They were part of the force that made the country wake up. And waking up is not the same as becoming virtuous. It is only the point at which denial becomes harder to maintain. I want to bring us back, for a moment, to one of those rich men's houses at the end of an evening. The guests have gone. The ballroom is empty. Servants move quietly through the rooms, clearing glasses, gathering linens, closing doors, tending fires or switching off lights. Outside, the city continues. Somewhere, a night shift begins. Somewhere, a train moves through the dark with freight that has already been priced, insured, scheduled, and financed. Somewhere, a family in a tenement sleeps in air that is too warm or too cold. Somewhere, a reformer is writing notes for an article. Somewhere, a worker is deciding whether joining the union is worth the risk. Somewhere, a senator is reading a letter from a donor. Somewhere, a child is opening a library book with a millionaire's name stamped inside the cover. That is the Gilded Age after the curtain falls. It does not disappear. It remains in pieces, distributed through the country it helped create. The mansions become museums. The companies become modern corporations or fragments of them. The scandals become case studies. The strikes become anniversaries. The laws become foundations for later reforms. The names remain on buildings. The questions remain in the air. And we, sitting much later, with electric light around us, with our own forms of wealth and influence, with our own arguments about power and fairness, are not as far from that world as we might like to imagine. The Gilded Age is not only a period in a textbook. It is a warning about what can happen when growth becomes an excuse, when admiration becomes obedience, when the rich are treated as proof that the system works, and the poor are treated as evidence that they failed it. It is also a reminder that exposure matters, organisation matters, law matters, memory matters, and ordinary people noticing the shape of power matters more than the powerful usually admit. Thank you for spending this long walk through the age of gold, smoke, marble, iron, hunger, ambition, and uneasy reform. What we have followed together was never only the story of rich men. It was the story of a country learning that wealth can build and damage at the same time, that progress can arrive with ash on its hands, and that a democracy must keep asking who benefits, who pays, who decides, and who is expected to stay quiet while the decisions are made. If any moment from this story stayed with you, the mansion with its servant stairs, the worker at the factory gate, the farmer facing the freight bill, the senator under the shadow of money, the striker watching troops arrive, the child in the tenement, I would genuinely love to know which one. Leave it in the comments if you want to, and if this kind of slow history speaks to you, stay with me for the next journey. There are always more rooms to enter, more names hidden behind the famous ones, more ordinary lives waiting under the polished surface. Until then, take care of the people in your house tonight. Notice the light around you, and remember that every age has its glitter, but the truest history usually begins when someone asks what is underneath it.